With the Anzacs in Cairo, The Tale of a Great Fight by Guy Thornton, C.F., Chaplain Captain to the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, Main Body. Recording by Adam Bielka. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Foreword. Persistent rumors, more or less exaggerated, have been circulated in almost every part of our empire with regard to the behavior of our brave Australian, New Zealand, and British troops whilst they were stationed in and near Cairo. I purpose in these pages to give a plain, unvarnished account of the real condition of affairs in that city. To deny the existence of unspeakable vice and grossly open immorality in Cairo is unhappily impossible. But I do deny, and deny most emphatically, that the majority of our splendid soldiers were guilty of the various excesses which have been attributed to them. It is true that a small percentage of rotters and wasters behaved as badly as it was possible for men to behave. But when the fact of the abnormal temptations of a large eastern city is taken into consideration, it will be realized that the wonder is not that so many fell, but that so many stood. I speak only of what I have seen and heard. I have preferred rather to err on the side of understating these rampant evils than risk overstating them. We are, as a nation, responsible to God for Egypt. As long as our empire exists, so long will a large garrison of British troops be stationed in that country. For their sakes alone drastic steps should be undertaken to abolish the present system of licensed and unlicensed vice. I realize how handicapped our rulers in that land have been in the past by the capitulations. We are at war now, and martial law holds sway there as well as elsewhere. By one stroke of the pen, the authorities, backed by public opinion, could make an end of that existent flaunting, barefaced immorality. For the reputation of our nation, for the welfare of our soldiers, present and future, I pray that that day may come soon. I also tell of the gracious revival that visited thousands of our soldiers, in order that the hearts of many parents whose boys lie buried on the steep slopes of Gallipoli may be comforted. Hundreds upon hundreds of men who left their native shores without having evinced the slightest regard for God and Christ were led in Egypt to a saving knowledge of Him, whom to know means salvation from the penalty and power of sin. If this book brings consolation to any stricken heart, vindicates the fair fame of our gallant men, and inspires any degree of desire that wrongs may be righted, I am well content to have my motives impugned, and to incur any hostile criticism. In conclusion, I might say that, except where otherwise stated, these lines were written whilst I was in an Egyptian hospital, and in London recovering from a severe illness, and perhaps lack literary style or finish. I offer no apologies for my message, although I regret that my busy life leaves me no time to present that message in a more attractive form. G.T. End of foreword. Chapter 1 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Our Arrival at Zeitoun. On Sunday, December 4th, 1914, the advance parties of the Australian and New Zealand forces disembarked and immediately entrained at Alexandria, and commenced their journey through the closely cultivated and thickly populated Nile Delta to Cairo. On each side of the railway line lay palm groves, fields of maize, cotton, millet, and berseem, a species of clover. We noted with interest the primitive method of cultivating the land with wooden plows drawn by buffaloes, horses, mules, and sometimes camels. The vivid green of the fields, the feathery date palms, the picturesque though appallingly filthy native villages, the silver threads which reveal the network of canals, combined in presenting to our view a strange and beautiful scene. As we neared Cairo, we saw, for what was to the vast majority of us the first time, the surpassing splendor of an Egyptian sunset. No artist, however great his genius, could do it justice. The golds, the crimsons, the blues, the grays are inimitatable. Time and again on the Australian desert have I gazed and raptured on the lights of the setting sun. In the South Sea Islands I have marveled at the infinite glory of the sky as the sun disappeared beneath the waves, noted the strange elusive lights that illuminated the coral beach, the waving coconut palms, and the tropical forest, and longed to be able to describe the indescribable. But never have I been so conscious of the bankruptcy of thought and language adequately to convey the scene to anyone who has not lived in the East, as on that evening when I saw for the first time an Egyptian sunset. Man's greatest emotions cannot be expressed. As a Cornish miner said when seeking to describe the peace of God which passeth all understanding, it's better felt than telt. And oh, the surprise of the afterglow! The whole sky flooded with soft, mellow, golden beams which transfigured into celestial beauty, immersed in loveliness, and in an effulgence of glory the previously stern and forbidding clouds. Everything was bathed in glory. The palms, the stately minarets, even the miserable native huts possessed a beauty, transient, it is true, but beyond the power of man to describe. The citadel at Cairo, surmounted by the alabaster palace and crowned with 3 great minarets, at last came into view. We detrained during the brief twilight, and marched to what was known as the Zeitoun camp. Correctly speaking, the camp was really the Helme camp, since it practically adjoined the railway station of that name. In Helme there are a few European houses, and a fairly large native village. Near to the camp stands the famous obelisk of Matariah, the oldest in Egypt. When Abraham visited Egypt, he must have passed almost beneath its shade. Joseph passed between it and its fellow obelisk, since taken away, on his marriage day when he was wedded Asenath, the daughter of the priest of On. Here Moses became learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Here Plato studied, here Herodotus wrote, and here for hundreds of years stood the great temple, which was also a university, the center of learning for the whole of the then known world. No great distance away lay the model suburb of Heliopolis, a place rich in magnificent buildings and possessing one of the finest hotels in the world. Behind us lay the cemetery of the old city of On, where it was impossible to walk a step without treading on the bones of those who had been buried there 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Away to the east stretched the desert of yellow sand and stones, and here and there a stunted shrub. No warm welcome awaited us. Our coming was unexpected, and consequently adequate preparations for our arrival were conspicuous by their absence. Our camping ground was the desert. Many of us, for the first time, had the doubtful pleasure of sleeping in the open air on the sand. Our tents had missed the bus. The night was extremely cold, and felt colder than it really was, owing to the great change of temperature between 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. I have often noticed the temperature vary from 30 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit in a few hours. We were hungry and cold. Historical associations may be interesting, but they certainly do not tend to satisfy the cravings of the inner man. At last, to our great joy, one of our number discovered that it was possible to obtain a cup of cocoa and a very small French roll from a Greek canteen keeper. The canteen was a small tent near a brick wall and was immediately surrounded by scores of famished men. Our horses had to be taken away to the nearest place where it was possible to find a fence to which to tether them. By the time this was done, we were ready for bed, and we had no beds and no blankets, nothing but our great coats, as our kits had been mislaid. The sand was up to our ankles, and we fondly, and, as it turned out, foolishly imagined would consequently make an easy bed. We were bitterly disappointed. We scraped out a hollow for our hips and carefully removed all the stones. But the sand, soft and yielding when we first lay upon it, became each minute harder and harder. I know that my body seemed to possess a peculiarly magnetic attraction for sharp stones which persistently worked their way through the sand and sought to pierce my skin wherever possible. There are happily few unpleasant situations which have no corresponding alleviations. It is marvelous what sombre satisfaction I derived from the sufferings of my fellows. Of course, as a padre, I regretted the very strong and sulphurous language in which they apparently considered their complaints should be couched. We walked about, swinging our arms and stamping our feet, and trying in vain to go to sleep, until morning dawned upon many very bad-tempered and hungry men. Some officers were fortunate enough to be invited to breakfast by the British officers of the Lancashire Territorials, who were camped near us. The rest of us had to be satisfied with another cup of cocoa and a French roll. All day long the transport trains came rolling in, and our joy was great when our missing kits put in an appearance. Hearing that there was a Y.M.C.A. tent in the Lancashire lines nearby, and realizing that if there was one thing more than another which would conduce our men's well-being, it would be a similar institution in our own camp, I took the car from Heliopolis to Cairo, and endeavored vainly to find the local secretary and seek to induce him to supply our needs. When I returned, the tents had not only arrived but were pitched. I shared one with several other officers. I hoped to have a good night's sleep, but was disappointed. There is snoring and snoring. One of my tent mates carried out the art to perfection. He weighed only 14 stone, but he had at least a 34-stone snore. Not only was it remarkably loud, but he rang the changes on at least 5 notes, and they were irregularly delivered. In despair, I went back to my nook in the sand and slept like the proverbial top. To my delight, the organizing secretary of the Y.M.C.A., Mr. W. Jessup, arrived the next day and interviewed Brigadier Colonel, now Brigadier General, Sir A. H. Russell, with the result that in a very few days a large Egyptian tent capable of seating 300 men was placed at our brigade's disposal. Chairs, forms, tables, writing paper, and envelopes were provided free of charge by that splendid association. Realizing that I could not hope to do better service to the men than by helping in this work, I offered to do all that lay in my power to make it a success. The Reverend D. Galloway, of the American Mission in Cairo, at considerable inconvenience to himself, also worked hard and faithfully and successfully. 2 of the New Zealand chaplains, Major Grant and Captain Blamiers, also lent their willing assistance. Our men thoroughly appreciated the conveniences which were so freely placed at their disposal in the tent, and it was crowded from the very first. Realizing the terrible temptations of Cairo, which I described in another place, we, who were interested in the men, acting upon the suggestion of the indefatigable secretary, Mr. Jessup, decided that it was vitally necessary immediately to organize strong counter-attractions. A committee was formed to provide for the well-being of the men, and, as a result of their labors, a weekly concert was instituted. At first the ladies and gentlemen of Cairo were the chief performers, but when the British New Zealanders arrived, we discovered to our delight that we had enough local talent to provide a good, clean, enjoyable program weekly. On another night, experts on Egypt, its history, and archaeology gave most interesting talks on their particular themes. Dr. Zwemer, one of the foremost authorities on Islam, delivered several magnificent lectures. the Reverend Mr. McNeill of the CMS at Old Cairo, Dr. Jays of the Nigerian Mission, Dr. Hume, head of the Egyptian Geological Department, and many others, whose names I am sorry to say I do not remember, contributed to make the weekly lectures an unqualified success. The other evenings were left free so as to afford the soldiers an opportunity of writing home, with the exception of Sunday night, when a service, generally conducted by the chaplains, was held from 7:30 to 8:30. The attendances at these free, in contradistinction to the compulsory military parade, services steadily increased. Indeed, it was not long before the whole of the seating accommodation of the tent was taken up. Each weeknight a very brief service, consisting of a reading of a few verses and an extemporary prayer, was held. A post-box was kept in the tent, and sometimes no fewer than 1,000 letters were posted in a day. Stamps and postcards were also sold, so there could be no excuse for any man to go into the city under the pretext of its being necessary. I have sold £10 worth of stamps on a mail day. During those early months I was on duty from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., and am certain that some of the happiest days I have ever spent were those in the Mounted Men's Y.M.C.A. tent at Zeitoun. The men's behavior was simply splendid, and to work with and for them was a privilege. My duties were multifarious. I cannot remember how many wills I have made. I only hope none of them will be contested. The men used to come to me for advice about business difficulties. Yes, and love troubles as well. One night, a boy, he could not have been more than 20 years of age, hung about around my table, evidently waiting for an opportunity of speaking to me privately. His usually round face was portentously elongated, and his eyes were wet, as he handed me a letter from his girl to read. There is an old proverb that absence makes the heart grow fonder. I suppose it does. Certainly in this case it had. But alas, she had grown fonder of someone else. In the letter, the lady said that she did not love him, but went on to describe the fact she loved someone else, Bob Betterer, and that she and Bob were going out walking. As I folded up the letter and handed it back to him, I said, I am afraid you will have to let her go. In accents of woe and despair, and laying intense emphasis upon the last word, he replied, But she's gone. Unfortunately for himself, Bob came to Cairo with a later reinforcement, and the evening after his arrival he turned up with an eye in the deepest of mourning. By a remarkably curious coincidence, my young friend's face also bore traces of battle. I made no remark, but drew my own conclusions. One of the greatest privileges that the Y.M.C.A. has conferred upon Christians is that it affords men of all creeds the opportunity of working together with the single object of uplifting their fellows. I certainly never worried about what denomination the men professed, and am positive that they, with one exception, never cared about mine. I was therefore somewhat surprised when, after selling 4 postcards for the enormous sum of 1 piaster, 2 pence halfpenny, I was asked this question. What parish in New Zealand are you a priest of? I am not a priest more than any other Christian, I replied. You are ordained, aren't you? Oh, yes. Are you not an Anglican priest? No, I am a Baptist minister. His face grew rigid, and handing me back the 4 postcards, he said, in tones of the greatest contempt, Please return my money. I was warned not to have anything to do with nonconformists, and I never will. I am sorry to say I was so amused that I burst out laughing. But a fine Church of England man who overheard the conversation by no means shared my mirth, and it took me all my time to prevent the latter from fulfilling his threat. Punching the beggar's head in the hope of putting putting some sense into it. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. The City of Cairo. Cairo, or Masr, has been described as being the diamond stud in the handle of the fan of the delta. A cursory glance at the map will convince anyone of the aptness of this statement. It is not only the greatest city in Africa, but possesses a much larger Mohammedan population than any other town in the world. It is the literary center of Islam, and within its confines is to be found the greatest of all theological institutions, the Al-Azhar, in which about 12,000 men are trained for the Mohammedan priesthood. Its population must now approximate 750,000. Kipling sang, "From east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." But here east and west have met. It is doubtful whether any other city of its size can boast of such a heterogeneous population. Let the experienced traveler sit for half an hour on the great piazza of the Continental Hotel, and he can easily distinguish the following races passing along the street in front: Ethiopians, Nubians, Sudanese, Syrians, Sikhs, Jews, Persians, Arabs, Armenians, British, Australians, New Zealanders, French, Italians, Americans, and other smaller nationalities too numerous to mention. The air is full of a babel of tongues, amidst which Arabic and English predominate. The latter language has, owing to the great influx of troops during the past year or so, largely displaced French. Arabic is a most unpleasant sounding language, being harsh and guttural to a degree. But it commends itself very strongly to any man whose orthography is not his strongest point, for each word is spelt just as the speaker happens to fancy it sounds, as the following examples will show. The town of Asyut can be spelled in nearly a dozen different ways: Asyut, Osyut, Osyut, Siut, Osiut, Siut, etc., etc. Arabic certainly leaves room for individuality. When doubtful as to the exact spelling or pronunciation, it is always safe to write it or speak it as seemeth best, and all is right. Mohammedism can be spelt in a variety of ways, and the Prophet's name in half a dozen. I only wish that in my school days I had been permitted to take the same liberties with the English language. I am afraid I sometimes did, but I have vivid and painful recollections of the fact that my efforts were not appreciated. Night and day the cafes are full inside and out with a motley throng of customers. Chairs are placed nearly across the footpaths of the very best streets. Here men sit, smoke, and play backgammon. The streets swarm with peddlers who accost each passer-by with earnest requests to buy. They are an unspeakable nuisance, and should be suppressed, if only to obviate the bad language their persistence evokes. It is impossible to travel a couple of 100 yards near Shepherd's Hotel without being pestered by sellers of flower stands, highly colored Sudanese beads, walking sticks, peanuts, muslins, silks, or photographs, some of which are good, but others vile beyond words. As soon as one leaves you, another takes his place. But of all the nuisances in Cairo, the chief is the bootblack. He is everywhere. It is almost impossible to have a meal in a cafe without one of the craft sidling up and asking if he should "clean boots, sir?" These pests watch the approach of a soldier from the camp at Helma to the railway station, then rush up and demand that they should clean his boots. If he is brave, or obstinate enough to reach Cairo, without yielding to their importunity, the same thing is repeated as soon as he emerges from the station gates. He shakes his head, but that is not sufficient. He threatens them with his cane, but to no purpose. Carefully keeping at arm's length, the bootblack walks round him, scrutinizing, with evident disapprobation on his dirty face, the soldier's boots. To escape, the latter takes the first car, but when he alights he is surrounded by a small host of the enemy, and as a rule succumbs. Queen Mary said that, when she died, the word Calais would be found engraven on her heart. I always thought her heart unusually hard. But when the Cairene dies, he must heave a sigh of the deepest relief. For he knows that when he passes into the great beyond, he will not be greeted with the familiar and exasperating cry of, "Clean your boots, sir?" Bargaining is the one thing the Egyptian loves. A rich native will be quite content to spend an hour or more seeking to beat down the price of his purchases for 2 piastres. To give a hawker what he first demands would probably be a dangerous method of procedure, since his early demise from heart shock would almost certainly result. The following is a typical deal. The day is hot, and the only fruits that it is safe to eat are those upon which nature has bestowed a skin. The guileless Egyptian has the unfortunate habit of cleaning the luscious-looking strawberries by the simple and effective process of placing them in his mouth and licking them vigorously and thoroughly. After this treatment they look so fresh and clean that, did you not know how they had been washed, it would require considerable strength of mind to resist successfully the temptation to purchase them. Grapes need the most careful cleansing before being safe to eat. The ideal fruit is the oranges, despite the fact that the hawker invariably carries them next to his extremely dirty skin, inside the blouse of his galabia. The familiar cry of, "Oranges, oranges, very nice, very sweet, very clean," sounds in your ears from morning to night. You ask, "How much?" "4 piastres, very nice, very sweet, very clean." Too much. Y.M.C.A. Go away. He will let you go on about 10 yards, and then he returns to the attack. "3 piastres, good oranges, very nice," etc. Yalla, a stronger mode of saying go away. 2 piastres, good oranges, etc. Waved away, though only for a few yards, he runs up to you saying, "1 piastre, you take him, give me money." The Israelites spoiled the Egyptians. I don't think any other race but the Jews would have succeeded. Ever since, the Egyptian has been spoiling everyone who has been so unfortunate as to have any business transactions with him. The Arabia cab driver is, as far as my knowledge of men goes, absolutely preeminent in his lack of brains. Certainly, his cruelty to his horses is past belief. I once got into an Arabia at the Pont Lamoun railway station, and directed the driver to take me to Davies Bryan's, one of the chief business establishments in Cairo, asking him at the same time whether he knew where it was. "Oh, yes, sir. All right, sir." He drove off, lashing his horse into a canter and then into a hand-gallop, but in what I knew was the wrong direction. I stopped him and pointed out the right way. Off he went again, and soon turned down a street which led diametrically opposite direction to the right one, and repeated this operation until I had to direct him at every turn by saying Shamalek to the right or Yamanak to the left. In Alexandria I took a cab, and after giving the driver the address and receiving his voluble assurances that he knew the way, I didn't, he drove me for over an hour, and ultimately pulled up at the very place from which he had started. He had not the slightest idea where I wanted to go, and had been beamingly content to drive aimlessly about the city, covering, I suppose, 6 or 7 miles. I then made him drive me to my destination, but his contentment disappeared and gave place to cursing when I paid him the legal fare. I knew enough Arabic to understand something of what he said, but until he had finished his remarks I did not realize how unutterably base, vile, and filthy were my ancestors for at least a dozen generations. He evidently knew a great deal more about them than I did, and from the trend of his discourse was strongly predisposed to hold to the Darwinian theory of the origin of man. For sheer, crass, downright, incurable stupidity it would be, I hope, impossible to surpass the Egyptian cabman. One early morning I was wakened by the sound of howling and wailing. At first I was inclined to think it was some stray cur that had been receiving a sound thrashing, but since the noise continued, I went out and saw a soldier administering a doubtless well-deserved hiding to a Berber who had been caught prowling about the camp. When I thought matters had gone quite far enough, I stepped up and stopped the soldier. In his gratitude the Berber flung himself at my feet, and commenced kissing my shoes, whilst tears were pouring from his eyes. Certainly the lower classes, oppressed as they have been from time immemorial, are not only not manly, but are despicable in many other ways. And unfortunately the soldiers, for the most part, only came into contact with the uneducated of the population, and consequently hardly a man had a good word to say for the native. Although the vast majority of the inhabitants of Cairo are Mohammedans, nearly all religions are represented. The following statistics will reveal their strength. Mohammedans, about 500,000. Copts, the Coptic Church, about 50,000. Greek Church, about 20,000. Jews, about 20,000. I have not been able to obtain late figures as to the numbers of the Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist, and other Protestant communions. The Catholics have a lovely cathedral, and the Basilica, their church at Heliopolis, is one of the show places of Cairo. Since there are so many Italians and French Cairenes, they must be a very strong body. The American Mission, with its 196 educational institutions, where 16,500 pupils are gathered, has contributed, as far as I am able to judge, more than any other religious organization to raise the Egyptian nation from the spiritual lethargy in which it has been sunk for ages. Its work has been mainly among the Copts, the lineal descendants of the pharaohs, and has resulted not only in the upbuilding of many of their churches, but in quickening to an appreciable extent the spiritual life of the Coptic Church itself. The Egyptian General Mission, whose labors are mainly directed towards securing converts from Mohammedanism, have already, although comparatively speaking, only recently established, accomplished a splendid work. Their headquarters at Zeitoun became the home of many of our boys, and there are hundreds who will look back upon Mr. Logan's and Mr. Swan's hospitality with deep gratitude. Indeed, words fail adequately to express the magnificent hospitality shown to our men by all members of these two missions. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 The City of Cairo Continued. To see and seeing to understand a city like Cairo and its inhabitants is a feat not to be accomplished in a month, the stay of an average tourist, or in 12 months, for after more than a year's residence I have come to the conclusion that my knowledge of it is, for the most part, merely superficial. There is a surprising elusiveness about the East and the Eastern. Apparently, all is open and above board. The people eat, drink, play, sleep, and pray in the open air. But the longer one lives in the Orient, the more is one conscious that beneath the surface there is something incomprehensible and mysterious. The Eastern alone can understand the Eastern. The bluff Britisher is constitutionally incapable of fathoming the depths of the native of the East, and is conscious that the latter, despite his seeming servility, holds him in contempt. The splendid electric tram service of Cairo makes it an easy matter rapidly and easily to visit each place of interest. From the citadel, or better still, from the Mokatamu Hills, which command the whole city and its suburbs, an excellent bird's-eye view can be obtained. Viewed in the light of the setting sun, the spectacle is a magnificent one. The graceful minarets, clothed in the soft golden light which beautifies even the dirty native quarters of the city. The desert, the oasis, the distant pyramids, the Nile as it wends its way through its palm-crowned banks, past stately palaces, all these combine to make a picture which it would be hard to equal for beauty and variety. Cairo is, indeed, a city of striking contrasts. The European quarter, with its magnificent buildings, is but a few yards from the squalid hovels of the poor. The Pasha's palace adjoins the paraffin tin-covered mud hut of the fellahin. Exquisite Saracenic work may still be seen amidst the filth of a poverty-stricken native quarter. The Rolls-Royce motor car of the rich Egyptian passes the old donkey diligence of the indignant Berber. The rich fertile land is separated but a yard from the barren desert sand. The grand and awe-inspiring monuments of antiquity overshadow the mean hovels of the decadent descendants of their builders. The European rubs shoulders with the representatives of almost every race under the sun. Close to the up-to-date business establishments of the European quarter are the old bazaars of the native, where business is carried on today almost as if it was 3,000 years ago. It is not true that the East knows no change. It does change, but so slowly as to be almost imperceptible. I have engaged in Christian work among over a score of native races, but it was not until I had to do with the Egyptians that I found it all but impossible to have for them the respect and love which has been evoked by the Chinese, Japanese, Maoris, the South Sea Islanders, etc., among whom my lot had been previously cast. The good old book foretold 2,400 years ago that the Egyptian should be the basest of all kingdoms, and that statement is true today. There are, of course, splendid exceptions to the general rule, but the average lower-class native is untrustworthy, a liar, and a plausible one at that. He loves bargaining, as the following conversation, which took place in my tent, will show. A peddler was trying to sell me some antiques. Among them was a scarab. I asked him, how much? 200 piastres. No good, too much. I sell you 180 piastres. No, perhaps it was made in Luxor, world famous, or perhaps it would be more correct to say infamous, as being the place where spurious antiques are manufactured. No, this real antiquer, me swear it by Mohammed. Me find him in Kingsgrave. Him real, him goot, him cheap. Too much. You take it, 150 piastres. No. 100. No good. Imshi. 50. Imshi. 20. Too much. 5. No, I don't want it. 2 piastres, equivalent to 5 pence. You take him. Very good. Very nice. Real antiquer. No, won't give you a million, 1 farthing. Then Chaplain Major Grant, who was with me, said to him, How much do you charge for scarabs? It depends on whom ye sell him to. What do you mean? If Melkin man come along and he want scarab, me sell him for 200 piastres. If English, tourist, me charge him 100. If Australian, 75 piastres. If New Zealander, me take 50. If Egyptian, half piastre. Melkin, he got plenty money. English, not so much. Australian, throw money about. Egyptian, he no scarab made in Luxor. He no give more than half piastre. This scarab no good. Why do you tell us that? Me go away now, not come back to Cairo. Me no care you not take anything. With the native, deception is no sin when dealing with a Christian. They are not in the least ashamed when their lies are found out. They have one price for the soldier, another for the officer. I found I saved nearly 50% on my purchases by getting my orderly to do my shopping instead of doing it personally. Without doubt, the most interesting and fascinating place in Cairo is the far-famed Mosque. Each lane in this district is devoted to the sale of one particular article. For example, the goldsmiths, mostly Copts, who achieve the most intricate workmanship with the very same kind of tools used by their ancestors 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, have their shops in an exceedingly narrow lane, in places not more than 5 feet broad. The brass workers and the carpet sellers have each their street. Their shops are often not more than 8 feet deep and 6 feet broad. Despite the noisome smells, the endless jostling of the crowd, and the insistent and incessant importunity of the tradespeople, there is much to interest and instruct the European. Some of the larger shops in the Mosque have magnificent showrooms. In one, I was shown a Turkish carpet of moderate size, for which the seller asked 2,000 guineas. A bedstead inlaid with silver and mother of pearl, 800 pounds. In one of these warehouses, I was informed that the insurance covered stock valued at £500,000. Some very amusing advertisements were displayed, with a view to procuring the coveted custom of the colonial troops. I give a few of them. A Greek restaurant had the following: All sorts of spirits, so led here. I was informed by those who were better qualified than I was to express an opinion that it was chiefly bad sorts. Another restaurant had for its sign these cryptic words: Square dinkum feed, which was intended to convey to the passer-by the information that a good square meal could be procured inside. a liquor bar held out the following inducement to colonials: "Australians done here," and it was rumored that they were done brown. A similar advertisement read, "The best liquor is sold only in this establishment." The advent of our troops caused numberless restaurants to spring into existence, and each such place being, of course, a saloon as well as an eating house, and names such as the Melbourne Buffet, the Sydney Saloon, Ballarat Bar, Auckland Restaurant, etc., etc., were bestowed on them. But the most amusing advertisement was that of two Egyptians who opened a laundry near the Zeitoun camp, and whose sign read, "Two Egyptians want washing. Very cheap, very nice." The first part of this advertisement was undeniably true. In fact, I have not yet met a lower-class Egyptian who didn't need washing very badly. They are unbelievably dirty. The Mohammedan mother never washes her child, or suffers it to be washed, until it is over 6 months old. To bathe the poor infant would, according to their idea, be but to invite evil spirits, jinns, to enter into it. Unfortunately, however, they apparently forget to wash it when the 6 months have passed, being, I suppose, under the impression that cleanliness is a luxury that can safely be dispensed with. The poor children of heathenism, brought up amidst dirt and squalor, hearing the foulest of foul talk, rarely educated, save by the Christian missionary, what chance have they? Is it to be marveled at that nearly 75% of them die before they reach the age of knowing good from evil? Is it not far better that they should? I may be unorthodox, but it is my profound conviction that there will be found in the eternal presence of him who said, "Suffer little children to come unto me," more heathen children than many Christians seem to imagine. To say, as one good but narrow man, that is, if a person can be good in the truest sense of the word, and at the same time be narrow, did when speaking of them, "They were not baptized, and of course there was no hope for them," is simply inconceivable. "If God didn't have mercy on those poor kids," said a blunt, rough Christian soldier to me when repeating the first remark, "I wouldn't have much to do with them. I don't see a word in the Bible which says that children who are not old enough to believe should be baptized. And God is not the sort to condemn unjustly any child for something over which it had no control, and for which no one could blame it. I couldn't stick it," the statement, and told him straight that to believe what he did was to insult not only God's love, but God's brains. I am absolutely convinced that the majority of these children of heathenism will be saved. Although poor, although ill-housed, and ill-clad, even the lowest class seem to have sufficient to eat. The mildness of the climate is such that the lack of what we would consider sufficient shelter and clothing does not seem seriously to affect the health of the people. It is, so old residents of Egypt have informed me, impossible to compare the present condition of the lower classes in Egypt with what it was prior to the British occupation. The days of the enforced corvée, when thousands of breadwinners were dragged from their homes and fields and compelled to work without pay for months and years in order to gratify the insensate ambition or sordid avarice of some pasha, have happily gone forever. Never in her history has Egypt been so fairly governed. Never has she as a nation been so prosperous. That is not to say that we as a nation are loved. We are respected and feared, welcomed by the Copt, who, for the first time for 600 years, dwells in safety, but disliked by the average Mohammedan. The latter, uneducated and consequently bigoted, would, I verily believe, prefer to be cruelly oppressed by one of his own religion than to be justly ruled by the unbeliever. But, much as British rule, despite the fact that it has been hampered by the existence of the capitulations, has accomplished, it has, until now, been unable to ameliorate the condition of the Mohammedan women. Cribbed, cabined, and confined, by her religion, the creature rather than the companion of man, condemned to suffer degradation whilst man is exalted, there is but one hope for her, one friend, one Saviour, our Lord Jesus Christ. It is significant that one rarely sees a native woman, other than a Copt, over the age of 50. I remarked on this to a man of wide and varied experience in Mohammedan countries, and asked him if he had noticed this, and, if it were the case, how he accounted for it. He replied that it was unhappily only too true, and that from his knowledge of the real condition of their lives, it was the hardships they endured, the neglect, the absence of all that made life worth living, that caused so many to die prematurely. Of course, there are, I am glad to say, many splendid exemptions among the Mohammedans, in which the women are well cared for and loved despite the fact that they are past middle age. But what I have said unfortunately is true in the majority of cases. Polygamy, the fatal facility of divorce that obtains among the Mohammedans, the perpetual friction in the harem between the favored wife and the other more unfortunate wives, the degradation of womanhood, should create in our minds a deep sympathy for these poor unfortunates. No man can compare the lot of women in a Christian land with the condition of women in Mohammedan countries. The difference is as great as that existent between the respective religions. I have had pointed out to me the house of an Egyptian who, so I was informed by a credible authority, although under 40 years of age, had over 30 wives, whom he had divorced upon the slenderest of pretexts. Another Egyptian, a wealthy landowner in southern Egypt, had been the husband of over 35 wives, and was the proud father of more than 100 children. Educated Mohammedans, however, have in conversation with me deplored these conditions most earnestly and wholeheartedly. I have mentioned these facts about the low status of womanhood in general, and wifehood in particular, since it accounts to no inconsiderable extent for the awful immorality that unhappily exists in Cairo. There is but one life, and that a life of shame, remaining for these poor creatures who by the laws of facile divorce, inculcated by Mohammed, are thrust out into a censorious, man-ruled world. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4 In the Esbekia and Fishmarket. I feel compelled to place before the public the real truth concerning the flagrant and unblushing immorality which is so manifest in certain districts of Cairo. I do so with considerable diffidence, since I am only too conscious that my motives in thus writing are likely to be grossly misinterpreted, and that I lay myself open to the charge of being either egotistic or prurient. Much exaggerated reports of the ill behavior of our Australian and New Zealand troops have been circulated through the length and breadth of the Commonwealth and the Dominion. Statements have been made which infer, if they do not actually state, that the great majority of our gallant soldiers were guilty of sins of impurity during the period when they were camped near Cairo. Owing to the nature of my work in the slums of that city, I am better qualified than many to give the lie direct to these reports. I also desire to place before my readers, as plainly as I possibly can, the actual conditions prevailing in these quarters, that they may to some extent realize the terrible temptations to which our boys were exposed, and so be the more disposed to temper their judgment with mercy to those who have fallen. I must, first of all, ask that it be borne in mind that tens of thousands of British, Australian, and New Zealand troops were stationed in and near Cairo. In every large body of men there will be necessarily a proportion of rotters or wasters. 5% of these make more disturbance and create more rumor than the remaining 95% who live clean, wholesome lives. To reflect on the morality of a large majority because of the immorality of a small minority is not only foolish but wicked. I here deliberately state that in a previous ministry of nearly 17 years I have not met so many noble men in the same space of time as I have during the 18 months I have been privileged to be a chaplain with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. The very best of our youth are to be found in the ranks, men of culture, refinement, and religion, who despite their environment rose superior to it, and by their manly, clean, wholesome lives did good to all to whom they came in contact. In justice to these, I feel it my bounden duty to justify the larger proportion of our men from the cowardly innuendos hurled at their heads by armchair critics who hadn't the grit and go to do what those they so freely criticize have done, resign the comforts of home and fight, in many cases unto death, for king and country. I know Australia from north to south, from east to west. There is scarcely a town of any size which I have not visited. Nearly 20 years ago I worked among all classes of men throughout Australia, and consequently know personally the social conditions of that great country. I have also travelled New Zealand from the North Cape to the Bluff. Realizing, therefore, the favourable moral atmosphere in which the majority of our colonial boys have been brought up, and knowing, as I know, the new, startling, and all but overwhelming temptations of an Eastern town, especially a city which bears such an ill repute as Cairo, I say that to me the marvel is not that so many, but so few fell. We arrived in Zeitoun on or about the 4th of December, 1914, and before a week had passed, tales, more or less exaggerated, were being told of the fearful prevalence of vice in its very worst and most revolting forms. The notorious Wasa'a, the sights to be seen there, the shamelessness of the women, the effrontery of the pimps, became common talk. Realizing, to some extent, the awfulness of the situation and the crying need that something should be done for our boys, I consulted Chaplain Major Luxford, the chief chaplain of the NZE force. He is an officer for whom I had and have, though in an increased measure, a high opinion, and in whose judgment I repose the greatest confidence. His opinion was that we as chaplains should rebuke this vice whenever occasion served, but should personally abstain from visiting the slums. I understood the reason that led him to this opinion, but was still, in my own mind, far from being convinced that he was right. So, in deference to his wish, I desisted for a fortnight from going near the notorious streets. However, one evening, whilst reading my Bible, these words of the Master rang insistently in my ears: "I am come to seek and to save that which was lost," and coupled thereto, "As the Father has sent me, even so send I you." In these words I recognized what the Duke of Wellington termed my marching orders. I knew, as Major Luxford had hinted, that my motives would be liable to be misconstrued, and while I thought over the matter, was much inclined to choose the path of least resistance. I remembered how it was prophetically stated of the Lord Jesus that he became the song of the drunkard, and was called, and deservingly so, the friend of publicans and sinners. He not only made himself of no reputation, but lost all reputation from the viewpoint of the religions of his day, and I, since the servant cannot be greater than his master, must be content in seeking to follow in his steps, to lose my reputation as he lost his. A business or professional man may forfeit his moral reputation and yet not suffer materially, but let a minister of religion have but the faintest breath of slander dim the lustre of his character, and he were better dead. It was thus no light matter to me when I deliberately planned labours which I knew must inevitably expose me, in no small degree, to the malice of evil tongues, and which might wreck my whole future. On New Year's Day, 1915, a friend, a captain in the NZ.M.C., asked me if I had seen the slums in the Esbekia, and on my replying in the negative, volunteered to drive me through them. That drive was an eye-opener. I knew that things were bad, but not how bad. It was a nightmare, inconceivably vile and horribly grotesque. The narrow, evil-smelling, tortuous lanes, literally lined by these poor, degraded women of almost every nationality. The foul cries of solicitation sounded in a veritable babel of tongues. The barbaric dress and ornaments which many of them wore, the flaring lights, the flaunting evils, all combined to produce on the mind of a European an impression of unreality. Things could never be as bad as this, one argued, and therefore it must be a dream. But it was no dream. It was an infinitely awful reality. Each nationality seemed to rival the other in bestiality. Arabs, Egyptians, all Mohammedans, no Coptic girl is to be found earning her livelihood by prostitution, Circassians, Greeks, Syrians, Nubians, French, and Italians were all represented. Thank God, however, there was not one British woman in that motley throng. The government immediately deport any fallen English girl. For over half an hour we drove as fast as possible, through street after street and lane after lane, before we were clear of the shrieks of invitation, the coarse clamour, and the unspeakable sights of that veritable hell on earth. Tennyson sings, "Things seen are mightier than things heard." I had thought the work to which I had been determined to put my hand would be difficult, But I did not realize until I'd actually seen it for myself the full immensity and hideous awfulness of the task. A feeling of impotence crept over me. What could I, single-handed, do against so many? Could anyone hope to combat, with any prospect of success, the rampant evils of these foul quarters? One could but try. Success lay in God's hands. From that day when I first had a vision of the exceeding sinfulness of the sexual sins of Cairo, with but few unavoidable exceptions, I spent 4 hours each evening on 3 and sometimes 5 nights a week seeking to stem the foul tide of immorality that threatened to overwhelm so many of our soldiers. I made a point of doing this work on those nights which immediately followed the arrival in Cairo of fresh troops, whether British, Australian, or New Zealander, and on leave nights. Various causes have contributed to making the Saturnalia of lust so inexpressibly evil as it was at the time which I write. These hapless women flocked into the city from Port Said, Alexandria, the country towns of Egypt, and from lands over the sea to prey upon the thousands of British and colonial troops. Cairo, long before the latter's arrival, had always been a haven of refuge, a last resort for the demi-monde of the various seaports of the Mediterranean. 2 pages of text deleted at suggestion of censor. What is the number of these unfortunates? That is the question which has often been put to me by those who knew the kind of work in which I have been engaged. I can only speak approximately of the actual numbers in Cairo. There are, I believe, on good authority, 2,300 licensed native women, and over 800 licensed European women. Exactly how many unlicensed native and European women ply their unholy trade, no one can say. Certainly they must number thousands. These licensed women, European and native, are for the most part herded together in a small area within close proximity to the most fashionable quarter in Cairo. Were it possible to give the exact total of all the licensed and unlicensed women, I am persuaded the British world would stand aghast and with one voice demand that the city be purified. Unlicensed women are everywhere, in the pensions, in hotels, and in the hundreds of liquor bars which infest the city. Despite the vigilance of the police, they infest the whole community in city and suburbs alike. I do not desire to discuss at length the pros and cons as to the advisability of the Egyptian system of registration of these licensed women, other than to say that in my opinion more have fallen as the result of these women's being able to assure the men that they were healthy, and backing their assurance by the production of a certificate, than through the unlicensed women, who far outnumber their more favored sisters. The examination of these women must be necessarily perfunctory, owing to the thousands who report themselves weekly or fortnightly for that purpose, and the limited number of medical men available for that unpleasant duty. Such an inspection may to a limited extent prevent the spread of disease, but that is all that can be claimed for it. Any specialist in this particular form of disease will admit that the absolute impossibility of pronouncing any woman to be free from venereal complaints, unless a lengthy bacteriological examination extending over many days has been undertaken. If this is not done, and if certificates are issued after what is necessarily an inconclusive inspection, the result is only to lull men into sinning under a sense of fancied security. Scores of men have confessed to me that it was by the production of these certificates that they were induced to yield to the entreaties of the licensed courtesan. All the present evils were accentuated by the fact that over 30,000 Australians and New Zealanders, a number which was afterwards, of course, considerably increased, were suddenly quartered within easy reach of the city of Cairo. From lands where, happily, few sexual temptations prevail, they were plunged into the vortex of a notoriously evil Oriental city. Cooped up in transports for from 6 to 8 weeks, under what to them was severe discipline, is it to be wondered at that the reaction was great? That a certain proportion, loosed for the first time from the restraints of home and of a Christian land, should plunge into excess? That, rejoicing in their new-found liberty, they should turn that liberty into license? That, withheld from the use of intoxicants for weeks, they should, in a city where nearly every shop sold liquor, drink to excess? The greater number, nevertheless, I repeat, behaved themselves as worthy representatives of their respective colonies. Over and above the causes which I have mentioned as contributing to the sad condition of affairs in Cairo was the liquor traffic. Had immorality been the only foe, the fight would not have been 1/10 as stern as it proved. I speak advisedly when I state that 9/10 of the men who fell did so under the influence of strong drink. Alcohol anywhere tends to produce immorality. This is more evident in Cairo than in any other place where I have been. Pure alcohol is surprisingly cheap. In the Esbekia and Fishmarket there are numberless bars. In one street there is one every few yards. The liquor sellers act in many cases in collusion with the keepers of the houses of ill fame, and freely permit the latter to use their bars as places for solicitation. Despite statements made to the contrary, I am fully persuaded, as the result of my own experience in noting the effects produced on our men, that the liquor has been doped or drugged. I have seen men who assured me that though they had only drunk 2 or 3 glasses, they had become stupefied, and remained in a comatose state for hours. One case I remember in which a man, a strictly moderate drinker, took but 2 glasses of whiskey, and was for 18 hours afterwards in a state of absolute insensibility. The effect produced, as I noted it, was to induce the normally moral man to become temporarily immoral. I have time and again seen men walk into a liquor bar as sober as men could be, and after 1 or 2 drinks behave like sexual maniacs. I have, not once, but scores of times, followed these men into the houses of ill fame, and found them in a state of insensibility or temporary insanity, and have by sheer force, before they could come to any harm, either carried or supported them out of the brothels, and sent or accompanied them to the railway station by cab or car. One evening I was standing near a house of ill fame in the Esbekia, seeking to prevent, and to a great extent succeeding in preventing, men from entering, when I noticed a young, fresh-faced New Zealander enter a bar nearly opposite. He was not there more than about 10 minutes when he came out, evidently under the influence of liquor, accompanied by a big Berber who was piloting him to the evil house, for which he was a pimp or tout. I followed them, but when I had passed a turning in the lane, finding they had evidently turned down a side alley, I turned to my left, and was in time to see a door being shut. I put my shoulder against the door, burst it open, upsetting the woman who had closed it, and, entering, saw the New Zealand boy lying on a low bed insensible, his head nearly on the floor, whilst the Berber was searching his hip pocket. I promptly gave the robber a kick which sent him to the floor, and turned to place the soldier's head on the pillow. As I did so, the Berber rose and rushed at me with a drawn knife. I stepped aside and caught him under the jaw with my right fist. He stopped rather suddenly and gave me no further trouble. The woman flew at me, and, before I could prevent her, scratched my face rather badly. When I had induced her to leave me alone, I picked up the man, carried him into the Y.M.C.A 200 yards, I suppose, away, and sent him in a cab to Zeitoun. He told me, next morning when he regained consciousness, that he had no recollection of anything that had transpired since his second glass of beer, and that 2 beers comprised all the drinks he had had that day. The G.O.C., General Maxwell, was responsible, I believe, for ordering the compulsory inspection of liquors. The contents were analyzed, and it shows how greatly adulteration was practiced, when the Egyptian Mail, some months after this inspection was instituted, stated that 37% of the liquors analyzed were adulterated. I am glad to say that this inspection, whilst it did not, as was scarcely to be expected, entirely abolish the doping, exercised a by no means inconsiderable effect in ensuring that the soldiers had purer liquor. Certainly the number of those who were rendered temporarily unconscious as the result of the use of liquor considerably decreased. I strongly suspect, however, that in some cases, if not in many, the drug, whatever it was not in the bottle of beer or whiskey, but was added to the beer when it was in the glass, and consequently no analysis of the liquor in bottle or bulk would reveal its presence. This suspicion I have heard expressed by many soldiers who did not hesitate to state that they must have been drugged in that manner. This unholy alliance which exists between the liquor seller and the prostitute is by no means confined to Egypt. I know of many cases in London and other English cities. One thing is certain: banish the liquor, and before 6 months have passed, 9/10 of the unfortunate women would have to seek an honest means of procuring a livelihood. Hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers fall only because liquor has first benumbed their judgment, lessened their self-control, deadened their consciences, and quickened their passions. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. Read by Adam Bielka. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 5. Evils of Cairo. It was in the first week of 1915 that I faced the ordeal of seeking to dissuade the soldiers from entering the bad houses in the Esbekia. One night I had been slumming near the bottom of Clot Bay Street, when I saw some men, all more or less under the influence of liquor, going down a narrow business street that lies immediately behind the Hotel Bristol. I followed them, and, to my great surprise, found that after proceeding along the street for a few hundred yards, they turned to the right, and in a minute or two were in the midst of the worst slum, the Fishmarket, I had up to then seen. I thus quickly discovered how much greater the task I had set for myself than I had at first anticipated. Instead of one, I had 2 large districts in which to work. Subsequent research, unfortunately, still further increased the field of my labors. Weekly I discovered fresh houses outside the licensed area, which it behooved me to watch with the view of preventing men from entering if possible. It was a great and pleasant surprise to me to discover that, hateful and loathsome as my work was, the men to whom I spoke invariably took my word of warning and counsel in good part. I never, to use their own expression, shoved religion down their throats, or preached at them. I felt instinctively that it was no use to assume any airs of conscious superiority, which, to tell the truth, I was far from feeling. I tried to regard each man as I would a younger brother, and a brother who was, at that particular moment, fighting his best against the terrible stress and strain of a great temptation. To scold a man at such a moment would only tend to exasperate him, and consequently do harm instead of good. What he wanted was that word of cheer which goes far to the warming of the heart, which presages victory. I invariably assumed that they were fighting to the best of their ability against defeat and consequent disgrace. God knew, although often it was hidden from my eyes, the brave struggle so many of them were putting up against the forces of evil without and within. Of course, I made many mistakes, but to the credit of the soldiers be it said that although I must have spoken to thousands, I cannot remember more than 2 or 3 instances in which the men were offended. And in each of such instances they were very, very drunk. One night, during the first week, I went up to an Australian soldier just as he was entering a house of ill repute, and said to him, "Don't you think that this is a good place to be out of?" He looked up and down, noted my badge, and then said meaningly, "I think so, Captain." He paused, and then resumed, "Especially for parsons," laying great emphasis on the last few words. I burst out laughing and replied, "You got me that time. Aren't you Irish?" He assumed a most pronounced Irish brogue as he replied, "Sure an, I am that." "Where do you come from?" He told me, and we stood at the door, laughing and cracking jokes for a few moments, until the opportunity arrived for me to tell him why I had taken up this work. He then said, "I'll do what you say, your reverence. I'll go home and be a good boy." "Goodbye, try to be good." I laughed and suggested that we should walk together to the station, which we did, and parted the very best of friends. I had another encounter with an Irish lad who belonged to an English regiment. I happened to be standing at the entrance to one of these houses, outside of which over 100 men were waiting to enter, and I spoke to each man just as he was about to cross the threshold. In the majority of instances, I was successful in inducing them to desist, when up came this Irish soldier and said, "By gob, you're a great priest, anyhow." "Why?" "I'm a Roman Catholic." "Are you? Better a good Roman Catholic than a bad Protestant." He had evidently mistaken me for a Roman Catholic, owing, I suppose, to the fact that I was clean-shaven, but now a dim suspicion of my orthodoxy seemed to flit across his mind, so he queried, "Are you a Roman Catholic priest?" "No," I replied, "I'm a Baptist minister." "Well, I'm damned." "I hope you won't be," I said. "Why?" "By gob, if you're not a priest, you're damned near good enough to be one." Having paid me the highest compliment in his power, he left me chuckling over what he had said. I have often thanked God for the saving gift of humor, and am persuaded that I should not have been able to bear the severe stress and strain of my slum work as long as I did had it not been possible even there to have occasionally a good laugh. It is impossible to treat men as if they were turned out by machinery. Various men demand different methods. Each had his own peculiar individuality. Consequently, I had to use every conceivable means in order to effect my desired purpose. A good joke was often, I found, the best lever. With others an appeal to their home life often touched a tender chord, as in the following instance. Going down the Diab Tiab, one of the worst lanes in one of the worst slums of Cairo, I saw immediately in the front of me a bright-faced New Zealander, obviously hailing from one of the country districts. He, evidently acting on a sudden impulse, swung round to the left and entered a vile Berberine house of ill repute. I followed him into the inner room. He apparently thought I was one of his cobbers or companions, for he didn't turn around. I stepped up to him and, laying my hand on his shoulder, said, "Look here, my boy, you wouldn't like your people at home to know that you were in a place like this, would you?" He looked at me for a moment and recognized me. His eyes fell. Poor lad, he was not more than 20. He was ashamed of my seeing his tears, and said, "God knows I wouldn't." The women, of whom there were 2 in the room, broke out into voluble entreaties, but a sharp word and threatening gesture quickly reduced them to frightened silence. He looked slowly round the tawdry, evil, and filthy room, at the black, painted, bedizened creatures, and when I said, "Then for God's sake, for your mother's sake, for your own sake, get away from this vile hole," he gladly and willingly assented. We walked together, and when we came down to the Y.M.C.A street, he stood still and said, "Thank you, Captain. I want to make you a promise." "What is it, my lad?" "I want to promise you that I will never come near this hell again. I thought I could trust myself. I only came because my mates did. I want to make it impossible for me to return to the Esbekia, and so I promise you that I will never go to such a place or near such a quarter again." A very few weeks elapsed before this boy came late one evening into my tent and yielded himself to the one who alone could save and keep. The next morning he wrote to his mother, telling her that he had done so, and, with a glad smile, came up to me as I sat at the Y.M.C.A. table, and, flinging the letter into the letter-box, said, "That will tell them what they have longed and prayed for more than anything else." His afterlife attested to the reality of the change he professed. It was, as may easily be imagined, no easy matter to dissuade men when they were sober, but I had to resort to all sorts of ruses to prevent intoxicated men from entering these vile houses. Many a time I have spent a full half-hour talking and arguing, on some other subject, of course, with semi-intoxicated men, until I was able to rush them down to the station or tram, assuming, I am afraid, a greater fear than I really felt, lest they should miss their train or tram or consequently spend their night in the guard-room, and the following morning receive from the O.C. that military panacea for all ills, C.B., which is not, as the non-military person might be disposed to imagine, an award for merit, but on the other hand a reward for demerit which entails confinement to barracks. One night I had played this, I trust, allowable trick, and had managed to persuade about 6 half-drunks of the absolute necessity of hurrying home to avoid punishment, had got them on the Clot Bay tram when one of them, who had just enough wit left to perceive that he and his companions had been outwitted, shook his forefinger solemnly before my face and said, "Oh, yes, I'm drunk, but not too damn drunk to know that I've been what's that blamed word? I've got it, diddled, and you, Captain, for all you look so blessed innocent, is the bloke that's diddled us." And all the way to camp he gloated over the discomfiture of his fooled cobbers. Those who have had personal knowledge of the slums of London, Paris, Berlin, Naples, New York, Buenos Aires, and San Francisco have assured me that the moral condition of Cairo is not worse than in those cities. But when I have questioned them as to whether that solicitation, which is so open and so shameless in Cairo, is permitted in any of the above-mentioned cities, they have one and all admitted that in that respect Cairo possessed an unenviable preeminence. The Y.M.C.A is a street which lies in close proximity to fashionable hotels like Shepherd's and the Continental. In it the appalling scenes of moral degradation can be witnessed in the broad light of day. Nearly all the houses in it are occupied by licensed women. Nearly every window has a balcony, and since many of the houses are 3-storied, a large number, sometimes nearly and often over 20 women, may be seen in one house, leaning over the balconies in every stage of undress, shouting out their foul invitations to passers-by. This street has become one of the show places of Cairo, and any afternoon after 4 p.m. and evening, thousands of soldiers promenade the street beneath, gazing at and passing remarks upon these shameless creatures. Unhappily, it became the custom for the older resident soldiers to take their newly arrived comrades to view this hideous exhibition of unblushing depravity. The result is obvious. Many men who had no intention of falling became habituated to the foul and suggestive sights, and, as Pope says, "Vice is the monster of so frightful mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen. Yet seen too oft, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace." So, many fell, and fell grievously. Unhappily the street is but one of the many where similar, if not worse sights may be seen in broad daylight. For obvious reasons, I cannot give in detailed descriptions of the incredible sights which not only I, but thousands of young soldiers, have witnessed. One Saturday, between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., I piloted Colonel C.E.R. Mackesy, O.C. of my regiment, the Auckland Mounted Rifles, through these districts, and he can confirm the fact of the unmentionable sights which we on that occasion witnessed. The actors in this indescribable scene were without exception licensed women. Temptation will exist as long as this present age endures. I doubt whether it would be to the advantage of mankind that it should cease. But normal temptation is one thing, abnormal temptation another. The one is essential to goodness, the other destructive of morality. I venture to say that the particular temptations of which I dare do no more than hint, permitted in Cairo, are such as no government should tolerate for a day. Throughout Australia and New Zealand, there has been for some time a rapidly increasing dissatisfaction that our men should be exposed to these all but overwhelming sensual temptations. I take this extract from a letter I received from a lady in South Australia. She says, "We colonials have a right to demand that our men, who have shown such marvelous patriotism, should be protected from such extraordinary temptations as prevail in Cairo and to a lesser degree in Alexandria," is the burden of their cry. No reason, save a strategic one, can justify the placing of the camps so near to the great cities. The loss in numbers from disease will, if ever published, astonish the world. I desire once again to emphasize that when one knows first-hand the real magnitude of the sensualities of Cairo, the marvel is that such a large proportion of our soldiers escaped unscathed. I have been compelled to hint at certain things, but no hints, however strong, can convey to a non-resident any real sense of the full enormity of the iniquities of Egypt. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. Recorded by Adam Bielka. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 6 More Evils of Cairo. Perhaps the most insidious form of temptation is that presented in the can-cans. These places are often represented by the touts as being merely dance rooms, and the invitation is generally couched in these words. Can-can place, very nice, very select, real native dances. And the unsophisticated stranger is taken to what is really a brothel of the worst type, where sensuous dances are performed by either nude or very partially clad women. In fact, as far as I was able to learn, every can-can is a brothel, and nearly every native brothel is a can-can. It is impossible to estimate the number of men who have been reached and ruined in these particular hell-houses. One night, down at the fish market, I saw a group of 12 to 15 British and New Zealanders enter a can-can. I followed them as they stood waiting for the disgusting and suggestive dance to commence, and spoke to them plainly as to their absolute folly in thus tempting temptation, and with all the power I possessed, urged them for their own good and for the sake of their people at home to come out. They listened to me dumbfounded, and when I had finished, their natural leader thanked me, and, turning to the others, said, "Look here, boys, the old captain's on the square, and it is up to us to clear out." I interviewed the head woman, and bluffed her into returning the money the men had paid, 5 piastres, or about 1 shilling each, much to her disgust and their surprise. I can, however, remember time and again having to use not only moral but physical force in clearing these can-cans of mere boys who had been induced to attend them by their vile touts. I failed, I think, only about 12 times in persuading men to leave these disgusting performances, and in each case the majority of the men who refused to leave were very much under the influence of liquor. Another pest is the tout. He is ubiquitous. His methods may vary, but his one aim is to inveigle men to these evil houses. Sometimes he places in the hand of a passer-by an apparently innocent card which bears the address of some infamous woman. Often he seeks to stir up the passions of some young soldier by showing him under the pledge of the strictest secrecy the vilest of vile photographs. But more often he offers to show the soldier some place where ladies very select, very pretty, live. There must be in Cairo hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these despicable parasites. Recently, I wrote this in December 1915, the police took active steps to rid the city of this class, happily with some success. It has always afforded me the keenest pleasure to administer well-deserved physical chastisement to members of this unholy and numerous profession. When I first commenced slumming, it was an easy matter to catch them red-handed, but as I and the nature of my work became better known, it was extremely difficult. I was foolishly congratulating myself on the evident fact that there was evidently fewer pimps in the Esbekia after 2 months' labor therein, and it was not until I was informed by an Arabic-speaking Cairo gentleman who accompanied me one night on my rounds that men and boys were detailed to watch for me, and my appearance anywhere reported by them was quite sufficient to make all the rest of these gentry disappear for the time being. There was one tout who was only too successful in his profession. I often yearned to have a touching interview with him, and impatiently awaited the opportunity. At last, one night, from the other side of the street, I saw him talking to some British soldiers, who were little more than boys. Pretending not to see him, I passed on, went up a side street, doubled back, and, keeping well in the shade, I listened to him exercising all his eloquence, which was great, and his English, which was small, in the endeavor to induce them to patronize the house for which he was touting. Making myself appear as small as possible, I advised the lads to tell him to clear out. My gentleman was virtuously indignant. "What for you say that? Good house! Come on, sirs!" addressing the soldiers. He had incautiously come too near. I made a jump, caught him by the scruff of his neck, twisted his galabia, and proceeded to administer a good shambok, the soundest thrashing he had ever received. He wept profusely and howled loudly. At length my right arm became somewhat tired, and sympathizing with him in his evident desire to leave my presence, I helped him a few yards with a well-placed kick, and then he ran. When he had got half a chain away, just like a whipped puppy, he suddenly realized the awfulness of the torture to which he had been subjected, and let out a shriek of concentrated agony. It was very comical. The crowd, which had rapidly congregated, burst into a veritable chorus of laughter. There are few things an Egyptian seems to enjoy more than seeing another thrashed. And the last we saw of him, he was still running. I never saw that gentleman again. Unfortunately, as soon as the novelty of visiting the evil native quarter had worn off, the more evil-disposed men began to frequent the Esbekia European quarter of the city. These women were as bad, if not worse, than their darker-hued sisters. Their greater attractiveness, of course, increased the danger, and more men owed their downfall and consequent disease to them than to the natives. One night I was standing at the door of one of these better-class European houses, speaking to the men as they were about to enter, and seeking to dissuade them. My efforts, I am thankful to say, were that night crowned with considerable success. Out of over 100 men who were apparently waiting to enter, I do not think 10 passed me. As soon as my work began to tell, the women came down from the rooms above, and gathering behind, cursed me. I had been cursed before, but never so heartily, and certainly never in so many tongues. In every language of the Levant, in French, Arabic, Italian, Greek, and broken English, they gave full vent to their individual and collective opinion of me, and, needless to say, their opinion was the reverse of flattering, and they evinced no hesitation in calling a spade a spade. If I have survived that cursing with any good opinion as to my personal appearance or character, they are certainly not to blame. I stood it, smiling. At last, enraged at the fact that not a single man was entering their house, the madame, the woman who owned the place, as they generally did on similar occasions, tried to stir up a riot. She piteously appealed to the men to knock the old beggar down, not to let grandfather, my slum name, spoil them their pleasures, and urged them to be men and show they weren't afraid of their officers. I have left out certain numerous and entirely unnecessary adjectives with which she garnished her speech. This last appeal was absolutely unneeded, for if there is an Australian who is afraid of his officer, or anyone or anything, I have never met him. 3 very drunk Australians drew their bayonets. This happened before the order was made prohibiting the men from wearing their bayonets in the city, and, loudly proclaiming their intention of sticking the old beggar, tried to get through the crowd. The moment the riot commenced, Madame was frightened. Jumping behind me, so as to be nearer the door in safety, she said, "You frightened?" I was a bit, but was not going to let her have the satisfaction of knowing it, so I replied, "No." "Me can't comprehend you English. You not frightened anything, not even God, I think." I could not help laughing at such a statement, coming as it did from such a source. The men, who, however, had taken my warning to heart, said to me reassuringly, "That's right, Captain, we'll stand by you." And then to the crowd, "The old captain," my name among the soldiers in evident allusion to my white hair, "is right. Let us stick to him." The small party of drunken Australians were still pressing in my direction through the crowd, which, with a laudable and pardonable desire to see the fun, divided as quickly as possible. My adherents caught them by the scruff of their necks, banged their heads against the opposite wall, and, lending them substantial aid with the toes of their boots, hurried them down to the main street. The leader of my party came up to me and said, "What shall we do with these blessed women?" I turned to the latter and urged them to go into the house and shut the door. They, for the most part, took my advice, but those who did not were seized by their shoulders, rushed into the house, and urged in very strong language to stay there and keep the door shut unless they wanted trouble. This advice was acted upon. A considerable amount of mental and spiritual as well as physical strain resulted from a long continuance of this work. The insufferable and indescribable stench was nauseating in the extreme. After hours of walking and talking in the Esbekia or Fishmarket, it was a great relief to leave the horrors of the slums and breathe once more the purer air of the European quarter in Cairo. Night after night, when I reached my tent, I was too tired to sleep. This, at last, told on my health, to such an extent that I became subject to serious internal troubles, and the PMO ordered me to cease from the slum work. It was with a sad heart that I perforce acquiesced to the MO's decision. Loathsome and unwholesome as were my labors, I had grown to prize wonderfully the privilege of being able in some degree to help our lads in the time of their great temptations. Another reason increased my grief at having to relinquish this work, and that was this. During the first few months, I met with great opposition, was often mobbed by the pimps and their satellites, and on 2 occasions nearly stabbed, but during the last 5 months, I had met with practically no opposition from either the women, pimps, or soldiers. In fact, on the contrary, many of the latter constituted themselves my unofficial bodyguard. I tendered to them my heartiest thanks. Some of them, I know, laid down their lives on the peninsula, but others are at the present, February 1916, still on active service. I cannot speak too highly of the way in which the men met my overtures. Never, unless very, very intoxicated, did they resent my interference. Often, in fact, hundreds of times, they voluntarily thanked me for what they were good enough to term my real interest in them. The roughest and toughest among them have on many occasions shown their appreciation. One such man urged me to accept a large sum of money as a token of his gratitude, and was genuinely hurt when I, of course, refused. Although I was denied the privilege of seeing service on Gallipoli, despite my earnest endeavors to get there, I am in a position to bear my willing and hearty tribute to the magnificent results evident in Cairo, which followed the splendid labors of the New Zealand padres at the front. They were Chaplain Major Luxford, Methodist, whose courtesy, consideration, and absolute fairness peculiarly qualified him for the position of senior chaplain. An ambulance orderly told me that when this padre was being carried down the hill, wounded nigh unto death, he begged the stretcher-bearers to put him down and take in his place a private who was not nearly so seriously injured. Chaplain Major Grant, Presbyterian, one of God's gentlemen who laid down his life in an enemy trench seeking to save the wounded. Chaplain Captain Dorr, Roman Catholic, of my own regiment, the Auckland Mounted Rifles, who, by his merry Irish wit, cheered many during the dark hours, and in his absolute unselfishness and fearlessness won the regard of all. He was wounded severely and is partially paralyzed as the result. Chaplain Captain Taylor, Anglican, whose frail-looking frame concealed an indomitable spirit, and whose faithful and long-continued labors, despite wounds and disease, attested his devotion to his master and to the men he served so well. Chaplain Captain Bush King, Anglican, of whose work the men speak so highly, and last, but not least, Chaplain Captain King, Presbyterian, who, I believe, put in a longer period of service than any other chaplain on the peninsula. Their respective churches may be pardonably proud of their representatives, and I, though a base padre, perhaps to avoid misunderstanding I had better say a chaplain at the base, bear testimony to the fact that in many cases the changed attitude to religion manifested by the returned soldiers was due to the practical Christianity they had seen exemplified in the lives of the padres and Christian men at the front. I know I reaped where they had sown, and from the time when the wounded and sick returned to Cairo, my work in the slums was aided by the evidently increased respect for the padre. The men had, in addition, been face to face, night and day, with death, and consequently they viewed life from a new standpoint. They had perforce considered eternal verities, and were in consequence much more disposed to listen to the glory of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I was agreeably surprised to note the keen and intelligent interest that such a large number evinced in things Egyptian. When a lecture on Egypt was announced to be held at any camp Y.M.C.A., the tent was certain to be crowded. Many became, in a surprisingly short time, remarkably well informed as to the history of the various ruins, etc. It was impossible to visit any relics of antiquity without meeting crowds of soldiers. Others became ardent, and in several cases fairly successful, curio hunters. The Zeitoun camp is pitched, as I have already said, on a portion of the site of the old university city of On. Amenhotep must be about 5,000 years old. Less than half a mile away was the old cemetery of On. In this cemetery our boys were fortunate enough to unearth not merely the common mummy beads, but objects of real historical worth and value. which, with the colonial's eye to business, they sold at good prices to the museum. Encouraged by their success, I hired 2 Arabs, borrowed 3 shovels, and on a burning hot summer afternoon commenced an excavation at which I judged to be a promising tomb. We dug and perspired, perspired and dug, and at last our united labors resulted in one mummy bead half the size of a wax match, which I promptly lost. One private of the Auckland Mounted Rifles discovered a fairly large marble covered with hieroglyphics, for which he received £14. An Otago lad, I cannot vouch for the exact truth of this, was so fortunate as to unearth the ring of the executioner of On, for which he received over £100. Every time I visited the Great Cairo Museum at Bulak, there were scores of soldiers examining with the greatest interest the various great statues and mummies, notably that of the supposed pharaoh of the Exodus, and I was always called upon to explain how it was possible for the pharaoh, who they invariably asserted had been drowned in the Red Sea, to be lying there before them. My explanation was, firstly, that it is possible for a man to be drowned and his body recovered and mummified. Secondly, that neither Moses nor the inspired Miriam record that Pharaoh was drowned. Had he been so, they would have scarcely failed to mention it. Also, I pointed out that possibly Pharaoh, like many another king, stayed in a safe place when the conflict was impending. Or perhaps it would be more charitable to assume that, with the egotism which seemed to be the heritage of those high places, he realized how intensely valuable his life was to his people, and declined to endanger their welfare by risking such a valuable national asset. Hundreds of boys, when on leave, used to congregate at the mosque, examining and buying quaint Eastern curios. It is a libel to accuse them all, as has been done, of spending their pay on riotous living. Some did, but the vast majority did not. I say without fear of contradiction that tens of thousands of pounds were spent procuring gifts for the old folks, and some of the young folk too, especially those of the fairer sex. Time and again I have known men to be unable to buy even the cheapest articles at the Y.M.C.A. because, as they explained, their last pay had been expended in the purchase of presents for loved ones in the homelands. The citadel, built by Saladin, usually called Saladin, the mighty and worthy antagonist of our King Richard I, was one of the favorite resorts of our men. Thousands of men nightly took advantage of the splendid facilities afforded them by the Y.M.C.A. and spent their evenings in the tents at concerts, lectures, or writing letters. Every cinema in the city and suburbs was literally packed with soldiers, and each concert and theatrical entertainment was liberally patronized. I mention these facts to show that instead of a large proportion of our men nightly visiting the slums, as has been alleged, only a very small percentage were in the habit of so doing. Had all made a practice of going down the Esbekia and Fishmarket, there would scarcely have been standing room in those districts. I am certain that not 5% of our colonial troops made a habit of frequenting these evil slums. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Bielka. Chapter 7. What should be done? Description of conditions so deplorable naturally leads to suggestions towards remedying them. The following points are therefore put forward for consideration by all who feel deeply the need that something should be done. 1. All those districts that at present are, to all intents and purposes, set aside for licensed vice should be cleansed. All licensed women should be deported from the country. This is not only possible, since it has been done under similar conditions elsewhere, but eminently reasonable. The only way to cure a cancer is to excise it. Failing this, should the authorities consider it absolutely essential to the well-being, health, and happiness of the city that such a parade of vice should continue to exist, then let them, 2. Remove these women to a more remote part of the city. They at present reside where they can ply their unholy trade to the highest possible advantage. 3. In case the authorities do not deport them or remove them from their present favorite strategical position, then surely what they did at Alexandria is practicable in Cairo, viz. To proclaim a district out of bounds to troops and enforce the prohibition. 4. Deliberate, determined, and persistent efforts should be made to prohibit solicitation by word or act on part of either women or touts. This has been done to great advantage in many parts of the colonies, and there is no reason on earth why a strong government could not do it here. In New Zealand, for example, a case of solicitation is marvelously rare. Of course, objections will be raised. It is worthwhile stating some of the stock difficulties in order to meet them at once with adequate answers. First, it is impossible to deport these women. They must live somewhere. The latter I grant. I have no objection to their living, but a great objection to the way they make their living. If they persist in pursuing their present trade, they should go. If it is impossible to deport them, how then did the authorities cleanse other eastern cities, which had as unsavory a reputation as that which now obtains in Cairo? Let us look at the question from another point of view. The authorities say by their actions, "It is impossible to cleanse Cairo." But is it impossible? It only requires the present state of affairs to continue, to ensure thousands of British troops being poisoned by a foul disease, and to disseminate, as they no doubt will, that disease in hundreds of places where it is, at present, practically non-existent. Second, it would cost too much to remove these women to a more remote position in the city. Let us consider what it costs the British nation if one Australian or New Zealander contracts this disease in its worst form. First, it means that when every man is needed for the defense of the empire, one man is lost. Far better for him and his had he died. Secondly, that one man has cost in equipment, training, proportional cost in military administration, transport, food, upkeep, etc., etc., at least £250. Multiply that sum by many hundreds and perhaps thousands, and the sum total will be, I fear, appalling. At present, the existence of these licensed and unlicensed women is a menace to the safety of the empire. They have lost the British army in actual fighting power. I leave to the proper authorities to say how many regiments. That body of men, efficient, might win a battle that would decide a campaign, which might end gloriously the whole war. Useless, they are not only a terrible drag, but entail an enormous, unnecessary expenditure. What does the toleration of these women cost parents in shame and sorrow over the fall of promising sons? Disgrace, disease, and death have befallen many men who under normal temptations would have remained straight, but under the indescribably abnormal temptations of the Esbekia and Fishmarket districts have succumbed. Third, declaring the districts out of bounds is useless. It could not be enforced. This has been done in Alexandria. Discipline is useless if it cannot be enforced. Extend the powers of the pickets. Get picked men to form a permanent picket, and instead of using them, as is done only to search these houses at certain hour for drunks and outlates, let them prevent these men from entering the districts. The fence is of more use at the top of the cliff than the ambulance at the bottom. Fourth, with the native police, it is impossible to prevent solicitation. Another plea made to me by a highly placed Egyptian official, an Englishman. Perhaps so. I am inclined to believe it, since with my own eyes I have seen nude European and native women within 2 yards of a laughing native policeman indulge in indescribably vile and filthy contortions in the open street and in the full light of day. But let a dozen honest British policemen report each case they see, and let the magistrate severely punish these women, and they would cease to be importune. Remember, the greatest danger is from the hundreds of European women, for it is a fact that the evil native women of Cairo do not make their main living from soldiers, but from natives, and the same holds true, to a lesser extent, of the European women. As I have already stated, in November 1915, the police commenced a crusade against the touts. Many were caught, and flogged. No mercy should have been shown to these vile parasites. Flogging is not enough. Flogging, coupled with hard labor for a long period, might, and I believe would, prove efficacious. The government have, in several cases, to my knowledge, prohibited certain women of the undesirable class from landing in Egypt, and have prosecuted and punished agents of this infamous white slave traffic. Under the present martial law, this power could be exercised in the wholesale deportation of these women to the lands from which they came. Failing that, it would be infinitely cheaper to isolate them than to license them to be a menace to the health of thousands of British troops in Egypt. Remember that 1. In these pages I have written only about Cairo. Of Alexandria I have little personal knowledge. 2. Unless this deplorable condition of affairs in Egypt is once and for all remedied, for generations to come, thousands upon thousands of British troops will, whilst on garrison duty, be subjected to the same temptations as obtain now. The past is irremediable. The present is our opportunity. Let us say, this evil must go, and posterity will benefit. For their good, for the honor of our beloved empire, for the sake of God and good, let us do right. Note to above. Except these few lines, nearly every word of this small book was penned in Egypt, when I was partially recovering from enteritis and colitis. Since my arrival in England, I have seen for the first time, and have been appalled by, the moral condition of London and nearly all the large towns in Great Britain. Not one, but scores of our colonial soldiers have remarked to me that the immorality so openly displayed in certain parts of London, whilst not as open and hideous as in Egypt, is simply awful, and it is certain that their old-time reverence for the homeland has received a terrible shock. I have sought, with some success, to do for our men in London what I did in Cairo, and have been unspeakably surprised at the criminal negligence evinced by the authorities. An Australian soldier said to me, "It looks to me as if they were the women who paid the police and not the government. They, the police, are either blind to the open solicitation or paid not to try to stop it." Are we at war, or are we playing at war? One is almost inclined to think the latter, from the fact that in this present time of crisis these women are permitted, is it going too far to say encouraged, to ply their hideous trade, and to render useless thousands and thousands of our soldiers by infecting them with a foul disease. Why should not each woman who is known, and the police should know, to earn her living by either in whole or in part by these means be sent to a special munitions work, there to help to end the war, instead of doing, as at present, more harm to our forces than the greatest defeat would entail? We believe in the liberty of the subject, but not a liberty that means license to prey upon our gallant men. We are fighting for freedom, and if we are going to win, we must first cope with this terribly insidious vice that is a cancer corrupting the whole nation. I know there are some who will say, "You can't make men virtuous by Act of Parliament." If that is the case, why prohibit theft, murder, arson, etc.? One thing is certain, that our soldiers, British and colonial, deserve the government's best help in removing from our midst the fearful temptations of the London streets. It has been done elsewhere, it can be done here. Banish drink, and with it, or very soon after it, prostitution will all but disappear. Drink, as every doctor of note will readily admit, 1. Causes lack of self-control. 2. Diminishes the power of discerning right from wrong, i.e., deadens conscience. 3. Quickens those passions of which I have been speaking. Sir Victor Horsley said to me in Alexandria that 9 out of 10 of the men who are to be found in the venereal barracks are there as the result of drink. From my own personal experience in Egypt, I believe he underestimated rather than overestimated the percentage. Is England to be the last great country to banish from its midst this drink traffic that seemingly has its tentacles round government, church, and society? This traffic cannot be mended. It must be ended. To win this war, it should be ended now. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Adam Bielka. Chapter 8 The Turning of the Tide. I have stated that as the immediate result of the new, and for the most part evil environment in which the Australians and New Zealanders found themselves, many of them cast off temporarily the restraints by which they had been held in check in the more favored homelands. Those of us who were laboring for their spiritual welfare became, however, increasingly conscious that the tide of pleasure and sin-seeking, which was at its full in January of 1915, was commencing to turn. The undue pursuit of pleasure, if that pleasure be a doubtful one, invariably produces a surfeit. The most disappointed of men is that man who has his lower longings satisfied. In all the strength of youth, with all the natural instinct for pleasure, many of these men become conscious that sin and even pleasure could not satisfy the truer, deeper yearnings of their better selves. They become less disposed to visit Cairo and more inclined to go to the Y.M.C.As in the various camps. On the 14th February the ebb began. Men who had up to that time persistently and consistently avoided spiritual conversation with the chaplains and the Y.M.C.A. secretaries began to welcome it. One man expressed to me in somewhat quaint phraseology the sentiments of many when he at this time said, "I am fed up to the teeth with Cairo and the rotten life I have lived since I have joined the army. I want something that will satisfy a man, something solid. I have taken particular notice lately of some of the Christian blokes. They may be wowsers," a term applied to Christians, "but they have got something. I'm hanged if I know what it is. They are different somehow. They seem to be satisfied, and not to act like us blokes. We go rushing round after pleasure like a lot of mad tomcats chasing their blooming tails, and then meowing and grousing because they can't catch them. Look here, Captain, I feel now that what's good enough for them is good enough for me. How can I get it?" It was an easy matter to lead such a man to the one who alone can satisfy the yearnings of the soul. One afternoon I was sitting at what I used jokingly to call my receipt of custom, which was, in other words, the chair in the Y.M.C.A. tent behind the table upon which the stamps, postcards, etc., were exposed for sale, when a Lancashire soldier came up and bought a half-piastre stamp. He went away and in a few minutes returned and bought another one, and repeated this operation so often that I at first did not drop to it that this was perhaps the lad's peculiar and original method of showing his desire of speaking to me privately. At length, noticing that he only came to the table when no one else was there, and lingered near it unnecessarily, I broke the ice by asking him whether he wanted to speak to me. "Yes, sir, I just do." "Well, what's your trouble?" "I can't speak to you here, sir." "All right, come to my tent." We went to my living tent, which was, for convenience in my work, pitched next to the big Y.M.C.A. one. As soon as he had sat down, he said, with tears in his eyes and voice, "Please, sir, I do want to be a Christian." "Why?" "Please, sir, my father and mother are real true Christians, Methodists, and I promised them when I left Lancashire I would keep straight and wouldn't swear or drink or go wrong. I meant to, but when I got with the boys I couldn't say no. I were afraid of being laughed at, and a bit it got worse and worse, and now I'm as bad as the worst. I want to get back to live like I used to. I'm very sick of the life I'm leading now. There's naught in it. I don't know how to get back, for I've got a long way on the down track. Can't you help me, sir?" It is impossible for me, a colonial, to attempt to reproduce the strong Lancashire dialect in which the man spoke, but I give the sense of his words as nearly as I recollected them, when I wrote down roughly that very evening a record of the conversation. I replied, "No, I can't." "You can't?
And what am I to do?
You believe in Christ, don't you?
I do, sir.
Then come, right now, to him. He loves you as if you were the only one on earth he has to love. He died for you because he loved you. He rose again from the dead that you might know his sacrifice for you was accepted by God, and therefore your sins, if you trust him, are forgiven, and that he might be able to give you the Holy Spirit in order to give you the power to think right, speak right, and do right.
Will Christ do all that for me? I swear, terrible bad, and I'm fair ashamed of my thoughts at times. How can I let him do all that for me?
Put him to the test.
Oh,
Would you believe me if I told you anything?
of course I would, sir.
If I promised to do something for you, and you knew I was able to do it, shouldn't I have to fulfill my promise?
Yes, sir.
Look here. I turned up my Bible at those words of Christ in John chapter 10, verses 27, 28, and 29. Does not Christ say, I give unto you eternal life? To whom does Christ promise eternal life?
To him who hear and follow.
Have you heard his voice?
I don't rightly know, sir.
Have you never longed to be a Christian? Have you never been miserable because of your sins? Have you never wanted to lead a true life?
Many, many times, sir.
Are you prepared to follow Christ? It means persecution. Your tent mates will give you a rough time of it. You will have to let on whose side you are on. Are you willing?
I'm at, but I ain't the strength to do it, sir. I mean to tell t'other chaps. I can't do it on my own.
I know that. Now listen to what Christ says. I give to you eternal life. That life is different from the natural life you have. It is a higher life, a life that has blood, strength in it. It is his own life. Christ gives himself to you so that you may win in the future where you have been beaten in the past, that you may conquer those sins which have conquered you in the past, that you may live by and in his power a clean life. Will you here and now accept Christ as your Savior, confess him before your mates, and live for him?
I would, if only I thought I could stick to it.
It is not you so much who will have to stick to Christ. It is Christ who pledges himself to stick to you. I read verse 28. They, that includes you, shall never perish, neither shall any, that includes you, pluck them out of my hand. Do you believe that? He promises to save you, if you mean business. He interrupted me.
I don't mean business.
Well, he promises to save you, and to keep you. Won't you put him to the test by asking him to save and keep you now? There in that tent, the man knelt down and accepted Christ's word at its full value, and rose, as his life afterwards proved, a changed man. He was the first whom, after 6 long weeks of an empty ministry, I had the privilege of leading to the Master. 2 nights after, he came in, his face beaming with holy joy, and insisted on seeing me in my private tent. We were busy, but I handed over my share of the work to my colleague, the Reverend Kenneth Miver, whose faithful service of love hundreds of our mounted men will remember, and went with him to the tent.
I've got 2 chaps here, as just like I was yesterday. They wants to be Christians, just as I did. You tell 'em, just as you told me. I can't remember exactly what you says. I am right thick in the head.
He told me hurriedly as we walked the few yards between the tents. These men, before many minutes had elapsed, saw the truth and became true followers of the Lord. Thus the work commenced, and before a week had passed, several more of the Lancashire territorials had made the great decision. These in their turn told some of their friends among the New Zealanders of the new and strange joy and power that had come into their lives, and the results of their testimony were seen the following Sunday evening. I had been speaking on the three great words in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, grace, faith, and salvation, and asked all those men who really wanted to live the Christian life and were willing to pay the price, videlicet, quitting everything that they knew to be sin, and openly acknowledging Christ to be their Savior, to meet me after the service in my private tent adjoining the Y.M.C.A. It was a little time before I was able to get there, as two men intercepted me on the way to ask me to help them in their spiritual difficulties. When at last I reached the tent, I, to my glad surprise, had considerable difficulty in getting in. Every available spot was packed with men. 4 or 5 were on my bed, and the rest were perforce standing. For nearly 2 hours I spoke to them individually, and with only one exception, they decided that henceforth they would, by God's good grace, live for Him who died for them. All the men who came into my tent were New Zealanders. Several belonged to my brigade, the New Zealand Mounted Rifles. Paul said, when speaking of the success which had attended his ministry, I labored, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. No true Christian worker can say anything else when God has been graciously pleased to crown his labor with an abundant harvest of souls. No man, however brilliant, however gifted an orator, however learned, can ever of himself lead one of his fellow creatures out of the darkness into the wondrous light, life, and liberty of Christ's bestowal. I have many times been asked to account for the wonderful ingatherings of soldiers into the Master's kingdom, which I have been privileged to see in Egypt, and later in England and Wales. I have only one answer. God was answering the prayers of his children in New Zealand, Australia, and Great Britain. I have been so conscious of that time and again, when so wearied in body and mind by my labors in the hospitals during the day, and in the slums 3 and sometimes 5 nights a week, that I have found it impossible to have the quiet waiting on God which is usually essential before preaching. I have felt certain that God would answer the prayers of believing parents and friends of these men, and never have I been disappointed. In tens of thousands of homes in New Zealand and other lands, prayer was going up for the welfare and salvation of these men. Is it, therefore, wonderful that God should honor their requests? No. To my mind, God being what he is, it would have been infinitely more wonderful if he had not. Although my motives in writing of this aspect of my work may be misinterpreted, I am conscious that, so far as I know myself, my one aim is to glorify the infinite love and mercy of the great Father. In a ministry of many years, I have been conscious of what to a large number of Christians may seem a strange fact, videlicet, that I have never yet seen one case in which the person who has been brought into a new and conscious relation to Christ can trace his or her conversion to one particular person. Many do, or rather think they do, but when inquiry is made, I have always found that, unknown perhaps to them, someone or some others have been praying for them. How many are the influences that God brings to bear upon the soul? The godly example of parents or friends, the word of the preacher, the silent voice of conscience, a text which has been impressed upon the mind by the Holy Spirit, the lessons taught in the hard school of failure, the yearning for purity and peace, the consciousness of some special sin. All these lead up to and culminate in that psychological crisis which we term conversion. One sows, often not knowing that he has done so. Another reaps. The reaping is impossible unless the plowing, the harrowing, and the sowing have preceded it. The reaping is the act of a moment. The preparation extends over months. The reaping men see and glorify, if so be they are not taught of God to realize that neither is he that soweth anything, nor he that reapeth, but God that giveth the increase. The faithful sowing, few remark. One man with the gift of the evangelist, people are inclined to forget it is God's gift, reaps largely, but his work would go for nothing unless many others had been used to do the preparation. All glory, praise, and honor be to God. The devil generally overreaches himself. He is wise, but not all wise. Hundreds of soldiers told me that one of the main reasons which led them to become Christians was that under the pressure of the temptations of Cairo, they realized as never before how weak they were, and how undreamt of until then were the possibilities of evil they discovered in themselves. That, therefore, which at first sight seemed to be a lure to the devil and sin, proved to be a friendly beacon beckoning them to God and goodness. Let me give you a practical illustration of this. One night, a fine, well set up soldier of about 35 years of age came to me in the Y.M.C.A. and asked whether he could speak to me privately. We immediately adjourned to my private tent, and I said, "Tell me what is the matter. Then I may be able to help you." "Last Sunday night I went with some of my mates down the fish market," perhaps the worst slum in Cairo. "I have been what you would call a fairly decent sort of fellow. Drank when I felt inclined, but rarely got drunk. I kept myself fairly clean. You know what I mean." I nodded. "Well, 3 of my mates went into one of the houses upstairs, and I sat down in the room beneath. I give you my word, Captain, I never till then realized what a devil I really was. I was sure frightened at myself. The temptation, came upon me so suddenly that it had nearly downed me before I knew where I was. I didn't know what to do. I felt all my good resolutions slipping away from me, and nothing but low, mean, dirty thoughts taking their place. I was certain I should go under, and then, like a flash, I said to myself, 'They say God answers prayer. I'll see whether he really does.' So I just says, 'God, keep me from making a beast of myself.' And would you believe me, Captain, in a minute I had got something from somewhere, it must have been God, wasn't it, to think like I ought to. I tell you, Captain, I am afraid of myself now. I can't trust myself as I did. I want to get a power from outside myself, into myself, so as to always listen, so that I need not be ashamed of myself." It was an easy matter to lead such a man in that frame of mind to trusting the keeping power of a loving, living, risen Christ. Night after night, for weeks after, in fact, every night that I was not working in the slums, men used to come and see me, and, as I have said, sought to receive the power to live above the new and evil environment in which they found themselves. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. Recorded by Adam Bielka. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 9. The Glorious Work of the Y.M.C.A. It is impossible to praise too highly the great and beneficial effect produced upon the Australian, British, and New Zealand soldiers as the result of the labors of the various secretaries of the Y.M.C.A. tents. Mr. William Jessup, the organizing secretary of the Cairo Y.M.C.A., rose splendidly to the occasion and seized the opportunity with both hands. Almost without any warning, Cairo had become alive with troops. Indians, Gurkhas, Lancashire Territorials, Australians, and New Zealanders followed one another in quick succession. Y.M.C.A. tents were established in every camp. The magnitude of the work demanded more secretaries than were immediately available. the local American mission supplied temporary secretaries to the Mounted Brigade tent, the Reverend Mr. Galloway and the Reverend Mr. Atchison filling the positions most ably and with great acceptance to the troops. The Reverend K. McIver took up, at the end of January 1915, the secretarial duties in the tent in which I was more particularly interested. Mr. Bell, secretary of the Glasgow Y.M.C.A. in the aerodrome camp among the Australians stationed there, Dr. Jays of North Nigeria in the Lancashire tent, and Mr. Oates in the other New Zealand Y.M.C.A. tent. The Salvation Army labored splendidly for the men in the fine hut which, with characteristic promptitude, they had erected. The Anglican Church also had a small tent. Thus, for the New Zealand troops, no less than 4 recreation tents were provided, in addition to which Mr. Logan of the Egyptian General Mission practically threw his house open to our boys. Each night of the week there was something of interest, a popular lecture, a concert, a competition, going on in one or other of these institutions. The soldiers increasingly found that their legitimate wants and their wholesome desire for pure recreation were catered for in the camp, and felt less disposed after a hard day's toil to go to Cairo. They found by experience that a soldier's life is no sinecure. It was drill, 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 from morning to night. Fatigue duties demanded their daily quota of victims. Guards always had to be kept, maneuvers taxed their strength to the utmost. Route marches made them desire to go to bed early, and made sleep so sweet, even though the bed were sand. Some of the mounted men were even heard to envy the foot sloggers, or beetle crushers, since the latter had no horses to look after. As the months slipped by, these duties were not slackened, but rather increased, and occasionally the grouser's voice would be lifted up, and the query heard, "To what purpose is all this training?" The O.C.'s knew, and the steep slopes of Gallipoli would never have been surmounted, had our gallant lads been one whit less sound of wind and limb. The stern route marches, the miles trudged over the shimmering sands of the deserts, the daily toil of guard and fatigue parties weeded out the unfits, and it can be questioned whether any men were better fitted, physically, for the sternest campaign in which perhaps the British had ever been engaged, than our fine boys. Picked men in the beginning, they were, on that long looked-for day in April, when they left their desert home to face the foe, trained to the last ounce, and fit for anything. What flesh they had on was muscle. Their faces were tanned by the hot rays of the eastern sun, and to use the stock military phrase and to mean it, which is another matter, they were indeed a fine body of men. Many a spectator's heart throbbed, and his face flushed with pride, when our boys of the main body marched through the 4 centres before leaving New Zealand. But if he could have seen those same men after nearly 5 months of strenuous desert training, and noted the improvement in physique and discipline, he would indeed have been more and more proud of his representatives at the front, and more confident of their manifest ability to uphold the honour and dignity of New Zealand upon the field of battle. The heroes of Anzac have made a name that will never die as long as history remains to tell the epic of their gallant landing, of their heroic charges, of their patient endurance in the trenches, and that day when, defeated but not disgraced, they made that marvellous evacuation with all the precision and martial skill of the best troops the world has ever seen. The old proverb says, "Distinctions are invidious," and to contrast our boys with, or even hint that they were superior to the gallant Australians and British, who shared with them the stress and strain of the shot, shell, and shrapnel, and the still more trying, infinite torment of flies, day and night for month after month, would be vainglorious and foolish. It is sufficient to say that they won for New Zealand a renown which every inhabitant of the Dominion delights to remember. The sadness of those who have lost their near and dear ones, buried thousands of miles from the island home which they loved and for which they died, is mitigated to some degree by the glory of their achievements and the imperishable renown they won. The story of that campaign will doubtless be written by many, who will be able to speak from their own experience and observation of the facts. This I cannot do, but this little book will, I feel, not be written in vain if it vindicates the character of those men whose death was so heroic and brings comfort to relatives who will learn from its pages how many of our soldiers learned during the last few months of their lives not only to be soldiers of the King, but, what is a higher, a nobler, a more enduring honor, soldiers of the cross. I can only write of my own experiences, and I do so with no desire of ignoring the self-sacrificing and successful labors of the other padres. My work was but a fraction of what was accomplished, and, if it were so honored, many more of our men were led in other ways, and by other means, to the central hope of weak and erring humanity, Jesus Christ. What little I was able to do was entirely or almost entirely due to the facilities afforded by that splendid institution, the Y.M.C.A. I cannot write of the assistance so freely and graciously extended to our men without alluding to the labors of Reverend Mr. McGill of the American Mission at Heliopolis in providing for their comforts and needs physically, mentally, and spiritually. He honored me by permitting me to cooperate with him on several occasions in his manifold labors of love. The Red Cross and the Y.M.C.A., under the able leadership of Mr. James Hay, conducted a most successful enterprise in the very heart of Cairo, the Esbekia Gardens, providing refreshments and clean amusements. The work of Mrs. de Castro, Mrs. Stewart, and many other ladies in the tea rooms had undoubtedly a most beneficial effect upon those men who went to that part of the city. I cannot speak too highly of the magnificent hospitality extended to our men by all the denominations of Cairo. The missionaries of the American Mission, without exception, placed their houses at the virtual disposal of our troops. Their kindness is beyond all praise. Hundreds of men were, I firmly believe, saved from the sins of Cairo by the gracious hospitality of these fine people. The Presbyterian, Methodist, and Anglican church people did all that was humanly possible to provide our boys with a home away from home. The directors of the Egyptian General Mission, Mr. Swan and Mr. Logan, who lived at Zeitoun, spent and were spent in their endeavors to help our soldiers. Many a convalescent man has found in their homes the sympathy and cheer which more than anything else contributed to his perfect recovery. The general European population, irrespective of nationality and creed, excelled themselves by the kindness and consideration they extended to the troops. It would be but a gracious act if, in consideration of the unbounded self-sacrifice of those good Cairo folk, on behalf of some small monument to be erected as a lasting memorial of our gratitude. The Young Men's Christian Association, at its central office, and by its more than a score of tents, proved itself to be indeed, and in truth, the young men's friend. It rose to each new call for the much-needed extension of its multifarious activities. Mr. Jessup, ably helped by his worthy helpmate, Mrs. Jessup, toiled as few could toil to provide for the mental, social, and spiritual needs of scores of thousands of troops in Egypt. I can only speak of that which I know, and testify to that which I have seen in the many tents where I was privileged to assist. Real, solid, spiritual work done by spiritual men rarely, if ever, fails to effect permanent spiritual results. The effects of the united endeavors of the churches and the Y.M.C.A. were increasingly apparent. I am by no means certain that I should separate them, for, as I understand, they are one. The church is the heart which prompts the work and which sustains the hand. The Y.M.C.A. in the uplifting of the young manhood of our land. For nearly a year I preached from 3 to 5 times a week, and often 6 times on Sundays, in hospitals, camp clearing stations, and Y.M.C.A. tents, and on only one occasion failed to see immediate decisions for the Lord Jesus Christ. The smallest number that I ever saw decide as the result of a Sunday's work was 10, and sometimes I have been privileged to witness over 100 men proclaim their allegiance to their Savior at a single Sunday service, and several hundred during the whole week's meetings. I, of course, was able only to see the work of grace as exemplified before my own eyes, and that was but a small part of the whole. The Y.M.C.A. secretaries could tell of hundreds upon hundreds of men who in their tents have made the great decision. To the best of my knowledge, thousands of men were reached, benefited, and in many cases won to Christ in a year by the various agencies of the Church of God. To him be all the praise. Such a work, however, could only be accomplished by the aid of the many noble, self-sacrificing Christian soldiers in the ranks. The following incident will serve to show how their influence reached many who could not have been won by any other agency. One night, after an address in a colonial Y.M.C.A. tent, I noticed among those who had expressed their desire to lead a new life, a man whose face was not only unusually ugly, but also really bad. Vice had left its indelible mark on his countenance. I asked a new convert who was standing near me who he was. He replied,
Do you mean that bloke standing near the door?
Yes.
That bloke whose dial is the dizzy limit?
Yes.
I don't know him, but he's a waster from his looks,
was all the information he could give me. I went over to
the bloke whose dial was the dizzy limit,
and found the poor fellow in deep distress. He acknowledged, with an oath every third word, that he was a goddamn waster, always on the blasted booze, couldn't live clean, but wanted strength to live as in his better moments he felt he should live. He knelt down and prayed, and in the strongest and worst possible language told God all he knew against himself. It was not a pretty tale, and was garnished with such frightful oaths that when he got off his knees, I said, Look here, name left blank. I believe God was pleased to hear you pray, but he would have been better pleased if you hadn't sworn so much. He looked at me in surprise and said,
I can't blasted well make out what you are driving at. I'm damned if I swore. I only spoke to God just as I always speak. What did I say wrong?
I recapitulated all the various oaths that I could remember he had used, and told him that the Christ, who alone could save him, had said,
Swear not at all,
and suggested that we should get down on our knees again and ask God to cure him of that habit. He consented and prayed something like this.
God, you know what a blasted fool I am. I can't open my mouth without cussing. Just wash my mouth out and make it clean, for Christ's sake, and do it quick, so the blokes in my tent won't think me a damned hypocrite.
The following Thursday night, I was just back from my work in Esbekia when name left blank's head was put through my tent door, and in suppressed tones of excitement, he said,
I have got a bloke here as wants to do the square thing with God. Just talk to him as you did to me last Sunday night, and I think it will do the trick. He's a decent sort of bloke, he is.
I asked him to bring his friend in, and then leave so that I could speak to him privately. In a minute, the bloke appeared. I asked him what he wanted to see me about. To my surprise, he was an educated man, an undergraduate of a well-known New Zealand university. He said, As a child, I jibbed on the miracles. I couldn't understand them, and thought there was nothing in religion. But I have been thinking more about religion the last few weeks than ever I thought before. And, name left censored, made me think more. I don't suppose you know. I smiled, I did know. But he was the foulest mouthed brute in the whole regiment, and I have to share the same tent with him. He never told a yarn but it was full of filth, from beginning to end. Well, since Sunday last, I have seen a miracle. He hasn't sworn once, and it's not the fault of the boys he hasn't. They've ragged him enough, and instead of being the most selfish man I have ever known, he is always trying to do something for the very chaps who rag him. Now I know I am not as bad as he was, but I am worse than I want to be, and God knows that if, as name left censored says, Christ cured him of his sins, I am willing to be a Christian, to be quit of mine. Scores of men, in a quiet, unostentatious way, by their lives so recommend the gospel of Jesus Christ that their comrades were induced by their example to follow the same Lord. Swearing is undoubtedly the besetting sin of troops. Some commence it because they think it manly and soldier-like, others because they have contracted the habit and cannot give it up, others because they are so ignorant that they do not know how to emphasize their remarks in any language other than swear words. Here again I found that many men became Christians in order to overcome this senseless habit. One night a soldier came into my tent and said,
Captain, my people are good Christian people. but I commenced swearing as a lad, simply out of bravado. And now I can't trust myself not to swear, even when I am in the company of women. I have tried my damnedest to give it up, but it's no good. I am swearing before I am able to stop myself. Can I get cured of that, and of foul thinking?
I, of course, had but to point him to the one who is mighty to save. One night several of the new converts were gathered for prayer in my tent, and the conversation turned upon what was the greatest difference Christ had made in their lives. This boy said, "The greatest difference I notice in myself is this. In our route marches we all, as you know," the others nodded sympathizingly, "get choke full of dust and sand. It gets in our eyes, our ears, our mouths. And before I became a Christian I was always cursing it. The man riding in front of me, the army, myself for having been such a fool as to join, and everything. Today, as you chaps know, the wind was awful, the sand was as bad as it could be, but I was just as happy as if there was nothing wrong. My heart was singing, and my lips had to sing too." I could weary the reader with countless stories similar to the above, but I forbear. However, I must tell of one man who came to see me in my private tent. Tears were in his eyes, and all he could do was to sit on my bed and repeat over and over again, "I can't get away from it." "What can't you get away from?" Again he repeated, "I can't get away from it." At last he told me that his whole family were earnest Christians. He had wanted to lead his own life, and at an early age had run away from home so as to escape what he called the endless talk about Christ and salvation. After being away for years, during which he had lived an absolutely wicked and godless life, war broke out, and he had been induced to go home to say good-bye to his people before leaving New Zealand. They told him that morning and evening they would pray for him. He got mad and told them not to waste their breath, and then, to use his own words, "I knew they were praying for me, and each day for weeks past I have been afraid their prayers would be answered. Against my own will I have felt compelled to think of my past and to long to be a Christian. Whilst you were speaking tonight, I felt that tonight I must yield. I cannot get away from their prayers." There you have, in 7 words, the secret of the salvation of so many of the soldiers. They could not get away from the prayers of God's people in distant lands. Against their own will, they were drawn by the Spirit of love to their parents' God. No power can avail against prayer. It is the mightiest of all known factors, and always prevails. One evening, at the conclusion of a meeting I had been holding in the Reverend Mr. McGill's Y.M.C.A. building, a tall, broad-shouldered, dissipated Australian non-commissioned officer came up to me and said,
Do you think God could do anything with a waster like myself?
"I know he can, if you will but give him a chance." Irrelevantly, he next said,
Were you not holding evangelistic services in
censored place name in Australia.
in 1899?
I was.
Weren't you at
Censored name mentioning a certain mission. Yes.
Do you remember the leader of the mission?
I looked at him more carefully, and, to my surprise, recognized in this waster the man who had, at the time he spoke of, been in charge of the mission, and said, "Yes, and you're the man."
I am. Where can we go to have a quiet talk?
I took him to the place where the pots, pans, and coal were stored, the only spot available, as the other 2 rooms were filled with inquirers. He sat down and told me his story. He had been a great religionist, a tremendous sectarian, an omnivorous reader, indefatigable worker, but, nevertheless, a poor Christian. On joining the AIF, he hadn't the pluck to show his colors, and had inevitably commenced to go on the downgrade. As is usually the case with men of that type of religious character, his drift to absolute infidelity and, in his case, flagrant immorality, when once he lost his sectarian moorings, had been extremely rapid. He was also a blasphemer and a persistent drunkard. I read to him Hosea 14 and explained it, and then suggested that we should pray together. He agreed. We knelt down. I prayed, and he followed. I have rarely heard such a prayer. At first it seemed as if the heavens were as brass. But on he prayed. Still it seemed as if the prayer only reached the ceiling. Then the prayer stopped. No answer. The silence seemed interminable, and was only broken by more prayer. The prayer of a man who had hope, for now he was pleading God's promises of forgiveness and healing. Again, there was a silence that could be felt, broken by the man standing up with tears streaming down his face and a look of indescribable awe upon his countenance, as in hushed, solemn yet glad words he said,
"Oh God, you've forgiven me, God. You've forgiven me, 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 me."
His voice grew lower and lower until the last me was but a whisper, and then again he said,
Me. You've forgiven me.
and now the prayer sounded like a song of wondering love.
God, I promise you, I'll do anything for you. Anything. Oh God, you're wonderful. Just wonderful. Oh, how wonderful to forgive me.
His afterlife and changed face bore eloquent testimony to the reality of his conversion. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10 In the Military Hospitals. One of a chaplain's chief duties is, of course, to visit the sick and wounded in the hospitals. In order to ensure the systematic visitation that alone can be productive of good, a roster was drawn up, and until the troops left for Gallipoli, 2 of the chaplains were detailed to visit the New Zealand hospital each day. After the main body of Australian and New Zealand troops had proceeded to Anzac, which, by the way, is not, as some assume, a Turkish or Arabic name, but the initial letters of Australian, New Zealand Army Corps. The chaplains who did not accompany them were attached for duty at Malta, Alexandria, Port Said, Cairo, and for a time at Helwan. I was sent to the last place to act as New Zealand resident chaplain, at the great El Hayat Hotel, which had been converted into an Australian and New Zealand convalescent hospital. Helwan is perhaps the oldest Spain in the world, and for thousands of years has been the resort of rheumatic and gouty patients who have sought to obtain relief by bathing in its naturally hot and medicinal springs. I had many interesting talks with the men, the majority of whom had been wounded during the early days of the fighting at Gallipoli. Visiting the wounded on the great stone piazza of the hospital, I remarked a young man who was apparently not more than 22 years of age. He wore dark spectacles, and the whole of his right cheek was seamed and scarred by livid lines which marked the track of 2 machine-gun bullets. Pale as death and attenuated in form he was, to judge from appearances, the most unlikely of men to win the coveted D.C.M. which he had earned, so his comrades vowed, half a dozen times over by the deeds of splendid heroism. I said to him, "I'm sorry to see you have been so badly knocked about, my boy." "Thank you, Captain, but I'm no worse off than thousands of my mates, and much better off than thousands of those poor beggars who are worse hit than I was. I'm glad to have been able to do my bit." "It must make a chap think pretty seriously over there," I said. "My word, it does. When I went there I had never given a thought to religion, but I hadn't been long on the peninsula before I found myself compelled to think mighty hard. I had always lived a fairly decent life, and with the exception of swearing, had very little to reproach myself with. But there I just felt I needed strength. And so I just gave myself to Christ, and God did enable me to conquer swearing. He took the desire for it away, and only once since the day I decided to be a Christian have I sworn. It happened something like this. We were in action, and at a critical moment the machine gun jammed. I lost my self-control and swore at one of my mates. And do you know, Captain, I am sometimes inclined to think that the reason I got this wound in my jaw was a punishment for my sin. I was real sorry, though, the very moment after I swore. Do you think that it was a punishment?" I was deeply touched, and replied, "He has not dealt with us after our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. No, my boy, I scarcely think so." "Well, sir, I'm glad you don't think so. Personally, I don't regret it very much. It was worth going over to the peninsula and being wounded to become a Christian. I am a better and happier fellow now than I was before. It's grand to have your conscience at rest. It's worth anything." Before I left him, he said very quietly, "I am glad, too, to be able to take back with me the DCM. My people will be so pleased." There are many who, as they read the casualty lists, are stricken to the heart to see recorded therein as "killed in action" some loved relative or friend who, as far was known, had never definitely accepted Christ as his Savior, and consequently Christian friends have been disposed to doubt whether God had heard and answered their prayers. To such God's message comes, "Be not faithless, but believing." God, being what he is, must, for his own honor's sake, hear and answer every believing prayer. I will now give in the words of the narrators several instances of men who, had they been killed, would naturally have been supposed to have died impenitent. However, before doing so, I will repeat the statement of a man who made no profession of Christianity. In one of the English papers, a clergyman of high standing was reported to have said that those men who gave their lives for the country would receive mercy and salvation from God, since "greater love hath no man than he giveth his life for his friends." In the tent this subject was being discussed, and the strong common sense of the majority of disputants was voiced and evidenced by one of them finally saying, as reported to me by a soldier who was present,
"I don't hold myself up to be a plaster saint."
Everybody smiled. He certainly did not look like one.
"And if those blooming parsons think any sane chap would swallow that lie, they are bigger fools than I took them for, and that's saying a lot. Here's J here," mentioning one of his mates. "We all know that the sort of bloke he is, and why he had to get out of New Zealand. He had made
his place of residence
too damned hot to hold him. Here I am. I swear like blazes. There is not a blamed thing that the Bible is up against that I don't do. And I say that we, if we get a bullet through our heads or hearts, go straight to heaven, is more than I can swallow. I am fed up with the wowsers,"
slang for ministers or Christians,
"who say one thing and say it to try to please us when the book they say they try to follow just says the opposite. The book says, I don't set up to know much about it, but I remember this much, he that believeth not shall be damned. There's no blessed shilly-shallying there. It's straight to the point. Do Jay and me believe? Of course we don't, or we couldn't live like we are living. If wowsers like that bloke lived among men and knew what they were really, they wouldn't talk such blooming rot."
An Australian who took part in the now historic landing at Gallipoli told me the following. "As we climbed up the hill, it seemed as if I was going to certain death. My mate on my left had his head blown clean off his shoulders. 2 others on my left fell, one dead, the other severely wounded. I knew, and had known for years, that I should be a Christian. My parents are real Christians, Presbyterians. I felt I must pray, and ask God to save me. I did so. I asked God to take me, and I promised there and then that I would serve him. Then something whispered to me through all the noise, 'It's a cowardly thing to ask God to save you when you are only afraid of being killed.' And for a moment I thought it was. Then came this thought into my mind, 'It's never too late to do right,' and so I prayed again, and my word, it fairly surprised me how God answered it so quickly. And I knew he had answered it, for I felt at perfect rest, and I didn't care much whether I was killed or not, for I knew I was at last right with God." Another soldier from South Australia said, in almost the same words,
"The fire was terrible. How any of us got through it alive was a miracle. I was with a bunch of men climbing the cliff, and I never expected to get to the top alive. My people are Christians. I knew that they were praying for me, and that sort of comforted me for a bit. But I knew enough to know that if I was to be saved, I should have to pray for myself. We sheltered in a hollow for a few minutes, and the bullets were whizzing just over our heads. There I gave myself right up to Christ, told him what a rather I had been, and promised him that if he would save me, I would do anything I could for him. And he did.
Had these two men been killed, who would have thought that they had, in the heat of the conflict, made the great decision? Yet they had done so, and their afterlife showed that the decision had been real. Another man, a Christian, told me his experience in the following words. As the boats drew nearer and nearer the shore, I was afraid that I should be afraid, and by my cowardice bring disgrace upon the name of Christ, for all my mates knew me to be a professing Christian. In maneuvers I knew that I was apt to get excited and very nervous, and so I asked God to give me courage and peace so that I might not dishonor my Saviour or seem to be flurried. Immediately it seemed as if the words of the hymn were spoken to me, and I used them as an addition to my prayer. Hold thou my hand, I am so weak and feeble, I dare not take a step without thine aid. And then a strange, indescribable peace possessed me, my fears vanished, and I was much cooler and more collected than in any sham fight. All through that long and terrible charge, I felt as if God's hand indeed held me. We flung ourselves down and dug ourselves in under heavy fire. We had advanced too far, and when night fell the Turks almost surrounded us, firing continuously from 3 sides of our hastily dug trench. Man after man fell. We had determined to die rather than surrender, so it seemed as if death was certain. Still I had perfect peace. Then the O.C. asked me to crawl out under fire to take lookout duty. I got there safely, and never in all my Christian life had such a glorious experience of God's presence, feeling absolutely assured that all was right whether I lived or died. At last a stray bullet hit me in the head, but I still retained the sense of the Father's presence, and felt absolutely assured that all was right whether I lived or died. I was wounded at night, and was not discovered until the next morning. Through it all I had peace. A wounded Highlander, a private, who before he enlisted had been a schoolmaster, told me of 2 men in his regiment who were great chums. One was a decided Christian, the other was not. The Highlanders were preparing to charge, and a feeling of deadly nausea crept over the non-Christian. He looked at his Christian friend and saw that he, at any rate, possessed a peace and power to which he personally was a stranger. In his fear and desire to be brave, there was wrung from him a cry to God for salvation. The answer came, and he said he seemed to hear a voice saying, "Fear not, for I am with thee." His fear vanished, and he was by divine grace able to play the man. The longer I worked in the hospitals, the more my admiration for the men increased. Their magnificent patience, wonderful endurance, and uplifting cheerfulness was beyond praise. It was very rarely that a man was heard grousing, and if he did, his mates gave him such a time of it that he found it convenient to assume a more cheerful frame of mind, although he might be far from possessing it. The following are but 2 instances, culled from many, which go to prove their unquenchable courage. One stifling summer afternoon I was visiting the New Zealand General Hospital. Lying on a cot in the veranda was a young New Zealand soldier, intently watching the efforts of a small ant to carry away the corpse of a large fly, and bursting into merry peals of laughter at the failures of the ant. As I drew near the bed, I saw that the poor fellow had lost his leg below the knee. A shrapnel shell had burst near him, killing his 2 mates and felling him to the earth. He did not lose consciousness, and called to his friend by name, asking him where he was hit. Receiving no answer, he concluded that he was either dead or insensible, and trying to rise to go to his comrade's assistance, he discovered, to his great surprise, that a foot in its boot was on the ground a few feet from him. Looking at himself for the first time, he knew that he had lost part of his leg, which had been blown clean off, and that this limb he saw was, or had been, his own. This dear lad's eyes filled with tears as he spoke of the death of his mates, but he was inclined to think little of his own great loss when he considered how many had got off worse than he had. But I think the most astounding example of patient endurance and cheerfulness was that evidenced by a British soldier to whom a friend of mine spoke on board a transport which was conveying wounded from Gallipoli to Alexandria. He was a big-boned, stalwart North Countryman. My friend noticed him lying alone and asked him how he was. He, in answer, said that he had lost his sight from shell concussion, and that the doctors held out no hope for its restoration. His right leg had been blown off near the hip, and his left arm had also gone. When my friend offered his condolences, the poor man simply said in the broadest of broad accents,
"Well, I thank God I have a little home to go back to, a good wife and 6 children. I may be a bit knocked about, but my life is spared, whilst many of my mates have gone under. I have a lot to be thankful for. Things might have been worse."
What a lesson to those of us who are disposed to grouse. If the bacon and eggs are a bit cold, if the weather is not what we wish for, if we have toothache, neuralgia, or any kindred but trivial complaint. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Distributing Comforts to Sick Troops. It was in the middle of August 1915 that I was called upon to assist Chaplain Captain A. MacDonald in the distribution of gift goods to the New Zealand sick and wounded. Great battles had been fought at Gallipoli. Hundreds upon hundreds of wounded were pouring into the Cairo hospitals in an almost continual stream. There were not sufficient chaplains left in Cairo to cope with the work of visiting, distributing the needed comforts, and taking services at the various hospitals and camps. This work was made a pleasure by the liberality and assistance received from all those who had the oversight. Nothing was grudged the men. We had instructions to procure anything that would conduce to their comfort and welfare. Many of the poor wounded men had lost everything and had come over from the peninsula wrapped in a blanket, no great privation considering the heat of the sun. I remember an amusing incident that happened in an Australian hospital where I was visiting a New Zealander who had been badly wounded and whose blood-stained clothes had been cut off him at Gallipoli. He was convalescent, and that afternoon was being transferred to the New Zealand General Hospital. I was in the ward when the sergeant in charge informed him that he was to go away from the hospital in exactly what he came into it with. Of course, the sergeant thought that he had come with a full kit. Without a smile, the New Zealander calmly removed every single stitch of clothing, sat on his bed, fully dressed, in an identification disc, and calmly announced that he was quite ready to leave. The sergeant glanced at him and said,
"Don't play the fool. Orders are to go in what you came in."
"That's just what I am doing," replied the patient. For men in that condition, it was the chaplain's duty to furnish shirt, braces, socks, anything, in fact, in the clothing line save his uniform. In addition to this, each man received a razor, some were blunt, very blunt, a strop, shaving brush, soap, a weekly issue of tobacco, New Zealand papers, etc., etc., besides which the sister in each ward received dainties to tempt the appetites of the invalids. I may be biased, but I do not see how more could have been done for the men by any government. There were, of course, many complaints because the sick and wounded did not receive any pay. Whilst sympathizing with the poor fellows, I could not but approve the reason why pay was stopped. Convalescents would in some cases, if given their pay, as soon as they were able to leave the hospital, get intoxicated, and coming back in that condition would upset the rest of the patients. Were it not for the rotters, the army would be splendid, but since they unfortunately exist, the decent men have to suffer for the misdeeds of the few wasters. Later on arrangements were made whereby the patients were permitted to expend a few shillings a week at the hospital dry canteens. Chaplain Captain MacDonald had all the machinery incidental to the distribution of many and various comforts to over 1,500 men in, at first, some 14 hospitals, in such good running order that when I assumed a charge of this department, consequent on his departure to New Zealand through ill health, I had only to keep things going. Unfortunately, however, I shortly afterwards fell ill and was compelled to leave Egypt and recruit in England. End of chapter 11. Recording by Adam Bielka. End of With the Anzacs in Cairo by Guy Thornton.